All right. Welcome, everybody, to Standing for Truth. My name is Donny Budinsky, and it is a privilege to serve as your host for this evening's program on Ask a Scientist Anything with Dr. Jerry Bergman. But first, before we get into open Q&A, we are going to set the foundation with a comprehensive presentation from Dr. Bergman addressing criticisms from critics such as Gutsick Gibbon. We have a lot to present and a lot to cover in this general creation versus evolution program. But before we get into Jerry's talk, Jerry, not your first time here on Standing for Truth. You were here a couple times in the last few months, as a matter of fact. We did a one-day seminar event, you, myself, and Helmut Welk, which was excellent. Why evolution or neo-Darwinism is overturned. And we did a program, a follow-up program where we got to dig even more into the creation versus evolution topic. And so, Jerry, how's your summer coming along, brother? And it's great to have you.
Busy, and I'm pretty busy. I'm responsible for 3 articles every week, so I have to work pretty hard to finish the articles.
Well, you're a blessing. All the work that you've done here on Standing for Truth, all the articles that you put out that I do my best to keep up on. I like how well-rounded you are because your articles feature a wide variety of topics. We were discussing pre-show as well. You've got several books for us to look forward to in the coming months.
Yeah, I have quite a few coming out.
One specifically on whale evolution.
Right.
Oh, that's going to be good. We'll have to do a program on that for sure because, believe it or not, there are still many apologists of evolution on YouTube, Jerry, that are pushing the Pachycetus dog-like creature to blue whale evolutionary story. So that's an important one to debunk. I want to encourage people in the audience, Jerry. I've got the relevant links up here for people to check out. For example, your crev.info page, several of your books here that people can purchase on ICR. I know you can also get I've got a whole library of your books behind me, which you can also get on Amazon and also on our website here, Dr. Jerry Bergman, where you can see his past presentations, Q&A sessions, and several debates. I kept Jerry busy last year, as a matter of fact. Dr. Bergman engaged several of the most prominent evolutionists in formal debate. That's what we like to do. Dr. Dan Stern-Cardinal, Dr. Chris Thompson, Dr. Zach Hancock, and Gutsick Gibbon, who you will be responding to here tonight. So before I hand it to you, though, for anybody who might be unfamiliar with Dr. Bergman or perhaps new to this channel and the Standing for Truth ministry, I do want to give Jerry a quick formal introduction. Dr. Jerry Bergman is a professor, researcher, and author who has taught biology, genetics, chemistry, biochemistry, geology, and related sciences at the college and university level for more than 4 decades. He holds multiple advanced degrees, has authored hundreds of publications and numerous books, and is widely recognized for his work in the origins debate and the scientific case for biblical creation. Jerry, I've got your slides up. The floor is yours. Take as much time as you need.
Okay, thank you very much. You mentioned Gutsick Gibbon, interesting name. I was really fascinated with her. She's a very articulate, very vivacious kind of person you want to sit down and talk with for 2 or 3 hours, and has a lot of the same interests that I have, and so I was anxious to spend some time with her. And but one area disappoints me, which I'll mention, and she brought up some good points in the debate, and I think they were worthy of discussion. I must mention probably 90% of the stuff I read is evolution. I read an enormous amount of stuff on evolution. I do sneak in occasionally to read a few creation articles, but my main focus is evolution articles because I want to find out what they have to say, and I want to try to evaluate their arguments. But at any rate, she did a show before she debated me, and she said, "In a few weeks," I'm reading from the transcript from the program, "a few weeks I'm going to be debating and discussing with prolific creationist advocate Jerry Bergman. Bergman is interesting to me for a couple of reasons. One, because he's obviously prolific. He's done a lot of writing in evolution, creation, controversy, and he's associated with many of the usual, notice, suspects, like the Institute for Creation Research. But what was her concern? Well, one of his concerns was Jerry Bergman was denied tenure at his home university, Bowling Green State University, and he claims the reason for this was that it was because he was a creationist. He said they denied tenure because he's a creationist and thus religious discrimination. He took the university to court over this and did not win the case because, according to court documents, he was actually denied tenure because he did not have credentials that he said he did. In other words, the claim is that I claim to have credentials in the area of psychology, and I did not have them. And this brings up a concern, and that is, I find overwhelmingly the evolutionists used name calling. They constantly, and I'll give you a few examples of that, they constantly use name calling, and they constantly make claims that are there, and they're easily refutable, but unfortunately, they don't tend to look at our side much. And anyway, so I thought I would go into that in some detail, especially because the claim that I falsely claim to have credentials I don't have is, as I will show, ludicrous. Some background. A lot of people assume that if you are on one side, you've always been on that side. Well, my father was an atheist, and my mother went along with my dad. My mother was trying to be a good wife and avoid conflict. And then in Sunday school, I went, when I was age 5, to a Sunday school, and my dad found out and blew his top. It's the first argument that I know that my parents had. My dad did not want me to have anything to do with religion. And that was my first, and for many years, my last experience with religion, and especially Christianity. I can mention at this church, there was a felt-tipped board, and from that, they put images of Christ and so on, and they presented the gospel. And I was pretty impressed with that. So I don't know for sure if I was 5, but I was pretty young. And I don't remember much else at that part of my life. And I can remember making a commitment. And I moved on, though, as so many of us do. And I became, in many ways, really a prodigal son. When I go out and speak at different churches, I find I'm not by far alone. I find so many people come up to me and say, hey, your story is pretty much my story. I was accepted Christ. I was involved in the church, etc. And then I learned about evolution and accepted it, rejected a lot of my previous teachings. And now I'm moving back to my original commitment because of my concerns about evolution. Okay, my first love was going to use bookstores. I've always loved to read. Probably read about a book a week. I can't do that now because I have too many writing commitments I have to work on. But I've read just tons of books. And people ask me why in the world I would leave atheism, or why in the world I would move in the direction I did. Well, a lot of it has to do with reading. I became very disillusioned with atheism. I realized that they made many claims which were not true, and therefore I rejected, eventually, for many reasons, I rejected atheism. There you can see my proud membership as the Board of Trustees of the American Atheists have given me their entrepreneur, and you can see that signed by Madeline O'Hare, who I worked with, by the way. We had very good relations. She published every article I sent. She was very positive about my work. And so when someone is positive about your writing, I guess you can't help but like them. And in this case, I had a good relationship with her. Although since then, she has turned out to be, if you watch much TV about her interviews, one of the nastiest persons in the world. But she was never that way to me. And there's some of the magazines that I published in, Skeptical Inquirer and the American Atheist. And I must admit, I had good relationships with the atheists. I was good friends, very positive experiences. But since I left atheism, became a creationist, I was excommunicated. And now the atheists will have nothing to do with me, which is kind of disappointing because I still agree with some of their same ideas. So eventually I concluded, based on science alone, that the evidence for Darwinism did not hold up. And then I concluded Darwin doesn't explain life, how we got here. What's the explanation? And I concluded there must be a creator. And then I was concerned with what faith set of values is valid. And eventually I accepted Christian theology and Christian teachings. Why reject atheism? Well, briefly, she was wrong about evolution. In fact, I often quote her when she said that atheism the doorway to atheism is evolution. Evolution is the doorway to atheism. And in fact, I have a book with that title, and it's a result of she's saying that, because I mentioned to her, why do we have so many articles about evolution? Our magazine is about atheism. Why spend all this time talking about evolution? And she said, well, because evolution is the doorway to atheism. And that is the main doorway that we utilize. And so therefore, when we talk about evolution, we convince people to accept the atheist worldview. And when I was teaching at Bowling Green State University, I should mention that I was not in the closet. I was out of the closet. And this is headline, the Blade, which is the main paper in my part of Northwest Ohio. And right on the front page, picture of me when I was teaching. And you can see there clearly what I was talking about. And so when we talk about the creation issue, Gutsick Gibbon mentioned that we have a lot of people out there who are teaching at universities who are creationists. True, but many are in the closet. And if you're not out in the open about what you believe, you don't have many problems. Okay, a couple of examples now. Julie Ingersoll wrote a book called Building God's Kingdom Inside the World of Christian Reconstructionism. And somehow she mentioned me and managed to get every fact, I say almost here, but almost every fact about me wrong. The book is about Christian Reconstructionism, and I don't even know what that is. She included me in her book because she somehow thought I was part of this movement. And under the subheading, Persecution and Conspiracies, she claims a conspiracy to shut creationists out of academia exists, and I'm one of these people pushing that conspiracy. And so basically she's saying, well, this persecution doesn't exist. It's a conspiracy that I'm making, which is just not true. And to try to discredit what I've done, she cites my book subtitle, Killing the Careers of Darwin Doubters. And she basically says, well, it's not true. It's wrong. And she basically then tries to demean me and what I say. And a good example is, she said, this is a quote from her book published by Oxford University Press, Bergman earned his PhD from Wayne State University. She then added, he claims the degree is in measurement and evaluation. She claims this is wrong. I didn't have a degree in measurement and evaluation. She said I had a degree in leadership. And I read that and I thought, where did she get these ideas from? I've never taken a single class in leadership. And so this is one of many, many examples where they get their facts wrong. And she never contacted me, which is irresponsible in doing research, writing a book. You contact people you write about and try to find out, is this correct? Is this true? And so I sent her information. I said, these are the courses I've taken. I sent my transcript. And I have 56 credit hours. This is for my doctorate work. And you can see that the courses I took are statistics, problems of measurement, computer use and research, variance and covariant analysis, and so on, including my doctorate research, in 56 hours. That's what my degree's in. So I can't understand where she got the idea that my degree's in leadership or some area like that. So that brings up Bowling Green State University, which keeps coming up over and over. I should mention I was there 7 years. I was the most productive faculty in the department, and this is well documented. Teaching at a college, they look at teaching, research, which is primarily publications, and service. These are the three things that they look at in order to evaluate your performance at a college or university. And right away, towards the end, when I went up for tenure at Bowling Green, at one of the faculty meetings, which I wasn't able to go to, I wasn't allowed, they discussed me and one of the professors there, Richard Burke by name, who passed away a few years ago, but he basically said Bergman misrepresented himself. This book, A Nation Without Prisons, he claims that he has a chapter in this book. Here is his resume. He claims here chapters in this book. Well, this is the book. Here it is. And there's no chapter in here by Bergman. He lied. And I never knew about this until later. The responsible way to deal with this is that he should ask me. Jerry, I understand on your Vita, you got a chapter in here in this book, and I can't find it. Could you explain? But no, he never did that. I never found out about this until later. Well, actually, I had a chapter in a book called A World Without Prisons, which you can see the title in the screen here, edited by Calvert Dodge. And there it is. You can see chapter 11. There it is. There's my chapter. And you can see on the next page, these are some criticisms which I discussed about the Community Achievement Project. And there it is. It's there. But again, they didn't know this. The university didn't know this. The professors didn't, because of the, I think, irresponsibility of Richard Burke. In this case, somebody should have said, well, is this true? They should have come up to me and said, can you explain this? And then I could explain it quite easily, but I never had a chance to. The other thing that caused me a lot of problems openly, and by the way, we have pages and pages of court testimony about the fact that I wrote this fastback, which is quite a prestigious publication done by Phi Delta Kappa, the Educational Foundation, and I talked about teaching about the creation, evolution, controversy. And you can see here, this is what I looked like when I taught at Bowling Green. And I wrote this booklet. Now, at this time, I was somewhat on the fence about this creation evolution business. And I made that very clear in the booklet, that I was looking at both sides. And over in the court case, which, by the way, was brought about by NEA, National Education Association, because they evaluated my case and said there's clear evidence of discrimination. And so they funded the entire case against the Bowling Green State University. And in the testimony, in the court testimony, they talked about this endlessly. I was pushing creationism, I was a creationist, and I was a science denier, and on and on. And Dr. Horton, who was the associate dean, who I worked with, he's my dean, he said, and I quote, Bergman, me, was one of BGSU's most talented and creative professors. I've known him for 6 years and find him to be a very personable and one of the most stimulating conversationalists that I have ever met. Dr. Bergman has an insatiable thirst for knowledge, coupled with the desire to write and disseminate his scholarly efforts. He is the most prolific writer on our faculty of almost 200 members. He writes well on a variety of subjects and also has an excellent publishing record in refereed and non-refereed journals. Dr. Bergman also maintains good rapport with his students. He likes to teach and does it well. By the way, Dr. Horton was in my class several times, as were several of the administrators at the university, including my department chair. In short, Dr. Bergman is a creative, flexible person who teaches and writes well. And this is part of the transcript was submitted to the court. Dean Elsaw, he added the same thing. He said, Bergman, me, is the most prolific faculty author in the college. And I must concur with the positive endorsements received from Dr. Reed and the PPPG Council that he has demonstrated and documented fulfillment of basic criteria, effective teaching, scholarly and creative productivity, and service. By the way, as I was preparing this presentation, I have a whole stack of letters from colleagues, very, very positive to my work. Not just these two, but probably 30 or 40 letters and affidavits from colleagues and supervisors at the university, which were very positive about my work. And Dr. Girona said he read a number of his Bergman's publications, found them thoroughly researched, well thought out, well written. His test and measurement book, I had published a textbook then, which I was one of the few in the department that published a textbook. His test and measurement book was excellent. I felt that it achieved what few test and measurement books had been able to accomplish, namely to convey the essentials and more so of the field in a very readable fashion, avoiding much information which is commonly taught, but usually absolutely useless in the field. The textbook is truly an innovative and, as such, a radical departure from the mainline test and measurement books that may have trouble becoming accepted. I am certain, though, that in time this approach will become more and more common. In short, Dr. Bergman is a trailblazer, and this is resume done by Dr. Girona in the favor of my case. Dr. Charlesworth, who was in the office next to me, said, Dr. Bergman was a gifted, versatile, and energetic person who has devoted his career to scholarly pursuits. His papers are well received, thorough, scholarly, interesting, and thought-provoking. He carries on a vast correspondence with other scholars in this country and abroad, seeking and exchanging ideas and information. He was clearly the most productive member of the entire department. And that, in some ways, caused me a problem because they wondered, how in the world could this person who's been on the faculty for 7 years, how in the world could he have so many books, monographs, and articles written? There must be something wrong. He must have padded his vita. Now, they had no evidence that I did, but some people felt I just must have. And Dr. Wood after reading several Jerry's articles that related areas of interest to me, he is an interesting and amazing, active and wide-range writer. Although I do not always agree with every one of his interpretations, I've always found him to be happy to discuss our differences and exhibits a clear understanding of my position. Peter Wood, by the way, was a Columbia University PhD, and his background was in evolution. Dr. Leslie Chamberlain, chair of the Department of EDAS, and one of the most prolific authors, said that I am one of the most prolific authors at BGSU, and with whom Dr. Bergman has co-authored several articles stated. Dr. Bergman is truly a research-minded faculty member who works quite diligently at certain areas in research, including those of crime and delinquency, suicide. Jerry Bergman is a prolific writer, a member of many professional associations, and my association with him has been pleasant and informative. We have written many professional articles together. My observation is that he works well with students. They relate to him, and he has a good rapport with them. I've had many conversations with Jerry during his years at BGSU and have found him to have a humanistic attitude toward others. Dr. Ron Cote added, Jerry impresses me as a consistently polite, empathetic, and sincere. Professionally, he is exceptionally competent, tireless, and persistent. His publication record is probably the most impressive in our college. As an academic, he is very intelligent, interesting, and informed. Moving on. So the National Education Association evaluated my case and concluded that I was terminated due to my religious involvement and my doubts about Darwinism. But the NEA felt I was clearly an outstanding professor, and therefore they clearly violated their own rules in not giving me tenure. Actually, I had tenure, and they changed the procedure and said I had to start all over again. And so it's amazing how people connived and moved around and tried things, and it wasn't a lot, but several people did whatever they could to try to get me out of there. There's clearly hostility, clearly anger against me because of the position that I took. And their Judge Budinsky was the judge of the case. The case was taken by the NEA to the district court, the Northern District of Ohio, and I was dumbfounded. This man was an alcoholic, no question. He was drunk on the stand. He had a problem with alcoholism for years. He was clearly biased, and I picked out a few things. The whole transcript's available, by the way. I have the whole transcript of the case, and the evidence is there in the case. And so just a few examples. He had poor judgment and odd behavior in court, and this can be partly explained by the fact that he was an alcoholic. And Kevin Worth, who testified for me at the trial, said my recollection of his demeanor was that he was frequently sluggish and slow to respond to many questions. He almost seemed to fall asleep. At other times, he seemed to be not paying attention. And on other occasions during the trial, he seemed easily confused about simple matters. I also distinctly recall that he had sported a nose that was redder than Rudolph's. He was obviously has been an alcoholic for quite a while. And so certainly after my trial, the 64-year-old judge was found guilty by Judge Alan Andrews in Toledo for driving while intoxicated, running a red light, the second drunk driving conviction in 15 months. In lieu of a long jail term, he was ordered by Judge Andrews to complete a 28-day detoxification program and alcoholic rehabilitation program at Hazardon Alcoholic Treatment Center. The DWI, his license was suspended for 5 years. He was also sentenced to 3 days in Toledo House of Correction. Now, this is right after, weeks after my trial, and after he made the ruling. You'd think that the appellate court would look at this and say, wait a minute, here we have a judge making decisions who was an alcoholic, who was drunk, who said appallingly stupid things. Any rate, going on. And by the way, for his punishment, he was rewarded with senior status. That means he got his full salary, but doesn't have to work a full caseload. So basically, he got rewarded for doing what he did. Some statements that he made, he continually referred to the jury, and of course, it wasn't a jury trial. There was no jury. And his 17-year-old son, I found this out when I was teaching at the University of Toledo, and I had a policeman in my class who was going to law school and get his degree in law, become a lawyer. And when I talked about Budinsky, just inadvertently, I mentioned his name. And then he personally went up to me and said, the younger Budinsky, Judge Budinsky's son, was drunk at the time. And this policeman who was in my class, studying to be a lawyer, he said, I gave him a ticket, and he realized he was driving a motorcycle, and he was drunk driving a motorcycle. He gave him a ticket, and this policeman mentioned to me the ticket was fixed by Judge Budinsky. And he later on was killed in a car accident with his motorcycle. And the policeman told me that if Budinsky had not fixed his ticket and basically would have punished him for drunk driving with his motorcycle, that his son might still be alive. And so this is another example of his misbehavior. Some statements made by the judge, such as, now this is a tenure case. If I hear anything more about tenure, I'm going to kill myself. What an incredible statement to make in the court. And the judge's attitude about the case was stunningly clear before the trial was over. He shot back at my attorney, for example, David Latanic, who was hired by the NAA, who was trying to explain the rules of academia. And David was trying to help the judge understand how academia works. And so the judge responds, I'm getting an education in academia, but I'd rather not get educated, and I'd rather get rid of the Dr. Bergman case. All right. What an incredible, appalling statement to make in the courtroom in front of the people in the court. And this is part of the transcript. It's just, I couldn't believe what I was experiencing in this court. I thought, what a farce, absolute farce. And it goes on and on. And so briefly, I mentioned here that a way of proving discrimination is basically comparing faculty. I got tenure or didn't get tenure. I had certain qualifications. You compare me with other people. And so basically, you look at those who are granted tenure. How do they compare with those who are not granted tenure? And so if I claim discrimination, well, what are my qualifications? What was the qualifications of other faculty? And so they're looking for different treatment. And basically, the judge in my case said, believe it or not, he said, I think we're going too far afield with what they did to somebody else. That's what the case is all about. They compare me with other faculty. He said, I think we're going too far afield with what they did with somebody else. We're talking about Gerald Bergman. Amazing. To prove different treatment requires making comparisons. How a similarly situated person not in the protected class of the claimant was treated. And the judge refused to allow any comparisons, which is the heart of the case. If you can't make comparisons between me and other faculty, there's no case. And we're back to it's a farce. And so what was the result? The result was he ruled against me. And I brought all these things up, long dissertation, and back, in fact, a Yale-trained attorney helped me. We had probably 300 pages of documents and other information defending what we were trying to say, bringing out some of the same stuff I mentioned in this presentation. And the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, again, I was appalled couldn't understand what's going on here. And I'll read word for word. The district court found that one concern of the tenure faculty was plaintiff's ethics. Is claiming to have textbooks. I wrote certain textbooks that I didn't write, which I mentioned one example. For instance, Dr. Davison testified that plaintiff misrepresented himself for the reason for the denial of tenure. He stated Dr. Bergman said he was a psychologist when he had no psychological credentials. Dr. Wurzman indicated difficulty in documenting the actual existence of plaintiff's books. Well, he could have asked me. I had all my publications, by the way, in a box in the faculty room. Anyone who wanted to look at my publications, they were all there. They could have just gone in there and looked at them, and some did. Some did. So plaintiff argues that any such allegations of misconduct can be disproved by him. Nonetheless, the evidence realized that the tenured faculty members were genuinely concerned about plaintiff's ethics, and their conclusion over his actual qualifications was premised on the difficulty of verifying his vita. Well, they verified my vita. They went through everything. They found out the vita was accurate, and thus no claims were made that the vita was not accurate. And this conclusion has come up over and over. And I'll give you a few examples. Wondered, well, before I got this finding by the Sixth Circuit, I called the Sixth Circuit and I happened to talk to a lawyer in training, I believe. He was doing an internship for the court. And he said, I'm very interested in your case because I'm a Christian as well. And when your case came before the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, I was very interested because I wondered, how is this going to be adjudicated? How are they going to respond to this? And so I said, well, how did they respond? He said, I'll tell you how they responded. The judge in the Sixth Circuit, basically, he looked at it, creationist, science denier, and he gave it to a law student, and he told the law student, write up a case ruling against this guy. That's your job. And the lawyer in training, wrote up a case, and that's the decision which was handed down, was the decision which was written by the lawyer who was working on, I think he was an intern at the court. And so the Sixth Circuit lawyers, pretty obvious, never even read a page of the 300 or so page brief that was filed by the Yale trained attorney. They never read a page. And this is the best they found. They really, this was it. I was amazed when I read that. I couldn't believe. Well, pretty obvious, as my friend who worked for the court, acquaintance actually, who worked for the court as an intern, he said that they're going to rule against you. They don't like creationists, and the courts consistently rule against creationists. By the way, I've researched about 200 different cases, and every single case, they ruled against the creationists, regardless of the evidence, regardless of the case. It didn't matter. Creationists rule against them, period. I never found a single case that the courts, judge, etc., ruled in favor of the creationists. Not one single case. And I challenge someone, if you can, please let me know. I'd like to read this case. But in spite of looking, I didn't find one single case. And this keeps coming back to me. A friend of mine let his pastor know that I would like, I'm doing speaking, and he'd like to have me speak at his church, this pastor's church. And so this pastor did some research and found this court decision. And he said the court proved that Bergman has no credentials in the area of psychology. He was a proven liar. We can't invite him to speak in our church. He's not representing the Christian values because he's falsifying his credentials, or he doesn't have credentials in this case. And so skip a few of these. And so do I have psychological credentials? Well, Wayne State University verified in writing. Bergman has a PhD. His minor was in psychology. He also has a master's degree in social psychology. And when he applied for the position at Bowling Green State University, Dr. Robert Reed wrote to me and stated, my credentials were evaluated favorably by the faculty in the psychology area. And I ended up at Bowling Green teaching educational psychology, child psychology, and related courses in the area of psychology. I also taught, of course, courses in the area of measurement and statistics and so on. My graduate coursework in psychology included 131 quarter hours well over the hours needed to have both a master's and a doctorate. And my PhD thesis was on the community treatment project, which was a psychological topic. In fact, the first courses I taught at BGSU were in the psychology area. And I taught in the psychology area during the entire 7 years I was on the faculty at BGSU. So the claim I have no credentials in the area of psychology is ludicrous. It's irresponsible. And I list some of the courses I taught: psychology of adjustment, developmental psychology, and so on. And I was also licensed as a therapist. I worked under Dr. Ricardo Girona. And after I earned my credentials, I was certified as a psychological assistant at first, and then got the full credentials as doing psychological work, doing counseling and related, and worked for Psychological Clinic, Arlington Psychological Associates. And so have a good background in the area of psychology. So the claim that I have no credential in the area of psychology is it's ludicrous. It's foolish. I also have 50 publications in the area of psychology, including 2 books. If they bothered to look at my record, they would see this. They could have asked me. But I found over and over in the whole evolution area, the evolutionists aren't concerned. They just want to slander people. They want to find information against somebody. They want to name call. They call them pseudoscientists, pseudopsychologists, or pseudo whatever. And so they're not concerned about facts. And again, I never had anyone contact me and say, is this true? And I can mention, after I left BGSU, I was hired as associate professor of psychology at Spring Arbor University. So I have a good background in psychology. And moving on. So the court ruled in the end, Bergman had no psychological credentials and ignored all the facts, which I've just gone through, which if they had interest, they would look and see, do I have credentials in the area? And here is the 2 books that I published. One is Understanding Education Measurement, and there you can see the first cover, the cover and the first page of the book, which I published. And then I later on teach at Northwest State College, and I found the same issues came up over and over and over at Northwest State. A peer of mine in class, she told her students that people who deny evolution, of course, I'm teaching at that college, people who deny evolution are incompetent. You shouldn't be teaching. And I had a student in the class came to me and said, you know, so-and-so said to the class that people who deny evolution, and I assume she was talking about you, are incompetent. And several other comments. In fact, one of my peers there posted on an anti-creation website about, yeah, I work with one of these guys at Northwest State, and he's anti-science and he's incompetent and so on. And so, yeah, I agree these people are incompetent and they don't know what they're doing, because how could they deny the most fundamental concept in science, and that is evolution? And testifying in court, that came up several times at Northwest State, actually. And here you can see that I was asked to testify as an expert witness in a number of court cases, quite a few actually, as an expert witness. Now, normally at colleges and universities, this is a good reason for promotion. You testify as an expert witness, this is called service. They want you to have teaching, research, and service. And service is one of the areas that many professors have a problem with. Well, I didn't have a problem with that. I was often testified in court cases. In fact, some went to the Supreme Court, my testimony as an expert witness. And so ironically, at Northwest State, they tried to terminate me because I was testifying in college and testifying when I was teaching at the college, testifying in court. And he said here, this is the affidavit done by a colleague, Dr. Edward Singer, who had a PhD from Ohio State University. The chief concern in Dr. Bergman's case is the courtroom testifying as a fact and expert witness. He related that this activity is incompatible with the best interest of the college. It's dumbfounded. Well, actually, the case I was involved in at that time, the attorneys found out that they were trying to terminate me. Northwest State because I was testified as an expert witness, and they got upset. This is illegal, and so they contacted the college and says you cannot terminate him because he is testifying as an expert witness in court cases. And so they reneged, and they basically changed our contract and basically said that we were allowed to, if subpoenaed, if our services required for a court case, that we were allowed to testify. So in that case, I prevailed. Now, Northwest State, you can see this is the faculty. Most had bachelor's degrees, a few had master's, a couple had doctorates. And you can see in the bottom of this page on the one side, my degrees obviously are well beyond anyone at the college. No one was even close to the number of degrees that I have. I had 9 degrees. In fact, not all of them are listed here, and well beyond. And you would think that with my level of education, my background, and so on, good student ratings, you think that at Northwest State I would be valued as a professor. But nope, same thing, same problem, same bringing me before committees and trying to find faults and trying to the science denier. Evolution is the foundation of all science. You cannot direct young men's minds in the area of science. And I taught mostly science there, by the way. I taught a couple of side courses, but almost all my coursework I taught there was in the biology, the chemistry, and microbiology and biochemistry areas. So anyways, not one of the 32 faculty had a single publication. And they say, well, publications not important. They certainly are. It's a college. Colleges, publications, service, teaching, all are important. And so to say that publication is not important, that's not true. I have many friends that teach at other community college, and they were consistently rewarded for their publication in the area of textbooks in this case. Other things that came up, and this is it's constant harassment, radiation issue, which is ironic. When I was cleaning out the lab, I noticed several small bottles of radiation. P32, which, by the way, has a half-life of 14 days, iodine-131, sulfur-35, etc. And these were sent to the college by the state under a program where they were trying to help educate students in the area of radiation. And they were sent, by the way, in June 30th, 1965. So they're obviously all dead. They're not active at all. And we have a Geiger counter. I checked in the Geiger counter. I wasted time, but they were all dead, of course. And then I was told, nope, I violated my contract because all radioactive chemicals were to be locked up. But we don't even have any lockup in the lab. It wasn't there. How can I lock them up when we don't have one? So that didn't matter. I should have locked them up. And I also mentioned I'm certified to handle radioactive materials. I was certified at the Medical College of Ohio. I used a lot of radioactive materials, a lot of P32, by the way, a lot of iodine-131. These were commonly used. I had to be certified. I had my certificate. I showed them my certificate. They looked at me and, well, you have to have all radioactive materials locked up, but they're not radioactive anymore. Phosphorus 32 decays into a stable isotope, to the stable isotope. Sulfur 32, iodine-131, etc. These all decay. They aren't even phosphorus anymore. Looking at that decay system, or at least the same isotope of phosphorus. And so I checked with the chemist, or they could have checked with the chemist, but it didn't matter. I was written up. I was disciplined because I didn't have all the radioactive materials locked up. And so, after a while, you really get tired of these kinds of things. And anyway, on one more example, I mailed a letter, an envelope actually, with a bunch of papers in it. I mailed them, and they came back. The address was wrong. And so the dean called me in his office and said, "You're mailing material for Northwest State. This is personal material. You should not be using Northwest State to mail this material." So I looked at the envelope, and the postmark was not Archibald, which is where Northwest State is. It was Bryan. And so I said, no, I paid out of my pocket to mail these. Looked kind of baffled and looked at me and said, oh, I'm sorry. No problem. And I left. And so that ended that. I also hired a typist. I did a lot of handouts, a lot of articles. And so I hired a typist, my own pocket I paid for. Affecting my health was obviously a concern. High blood pressure. And by the way, now since I left, my blood pressure is perfectly normal. So that's not a concern anymore. So finally, they got a meeting together and wanted to terminate me, wanted to go through the procedure to terminate. This is after I had been there for 31 years. And so I brought my 45 years of student evaluations to every meeting. Not one person wanted to look at them. They were not concerned. They were not concerned at all. They were concerned with getting rid of me. As one retired dean told me, who had left the college at this time, he said, they want to terminate you. The reason? Because you deny the foundation of all science, and that is evolution. And therefore, they wanted to terminate me. So anyways, the NEA, I spent, now they funded my first case, but this case, I spent $700 a year for NEA dues. There for 31 years. It was $27,000 I gave to them, and they did absolutely nothing to help me. They totally failed. And of course, by this point, I said, I've had it. I don't like to say bad things about Northwest State because they have an excellent reputation. They're a good school, and I often recommend Northwest State to others. It's really no different from most other colleges. And I have to mention that one of the main things I was asked is, how have you survived as a creationist at college for so long? How have you done so? A lot of people thought it was amazing that I've survived for 31 years as a teacher there. And one other case, Joseph Carmichael, I work for my third PhD in sociology. I've always liked sociology. And that was denied. They denied entry to my PhD in sociology. And so they gave a reason. The reason was Bergman arranged to take incompletes in several classes. The admission panel felt that such a record indicated an inability by Mr. Bergman to handle the course load and other requirements for the doctoral program in sociology at Bowling Green State University. And so, I've done a lot of work already, and I wanted to finish my PhD in sociology. I find that a very interesting area, kind of a break from statistics and the other courses I had been teaching. And so they said, well, I'm not qualified. This is what the Dr. Carmichael of Ohio Civil Rights ruled. And I thought about this, and I thought, look, I've got a 3.7 average my first master's, 3.5 my second master's, 3.8 for my third, fourth, and fifth master's degree, a 4.0 for both my first and second PhDs. I'm a member of Mensa, top 2% of the population intellectually. When I took the test, above 99.96 percentile, which is 4 out of every 10,000 people. I scored the 90th percentile for verbal GRE, the 68th for quantitative, that was my slow area, I guess, and 98th percentile for subject test, which was sociology. So here I'm in the 98th percentile for the GRE for sociology, and yet they said I was not qualified to complete my PhD in sociology. So even in this area, you get problems. And I have 5 books I published in this area, shows the antagonism is enormous against people who are creationists, not just in science, but also in other areas. And I have now 2,234 publications. And moving on, my article has been translated into 15 languages, French, German, Italian, and so on. And books that have chapters I included in are in 2,500 college libraries in 65 countries. And I did ALIDOL.com search, which looks for books, and found that they listed 535 of my titles. So basically, the conflict was, we are the product of an intelligent designer, which is my position, or we're not the product of an intelligent designer. And that is consistently the college's position. And moving on, some of the name calling, which is again everywhere. I have been voted in this website as a loon. Our next loon is Young Earth Creationists. at the Institute for Creation Research, and I am, they said, another staunch and thoroughly confused front fighter whose main argument is how persecuted the dissonance to the tyranny of evolution are. In short, your standard, I cannot discuss the evidence, so I'll try to frame my opponents instead. And so this is a long, discussion of how bad I am. And they conclude Bergman is a dishonest writer, a snorer, and a conspiracy theorist who fabricates stories about persecution of religious scientists. His most nauseating feature is his tendency to snow debates and avoid dealing with devastating objections. Bergman is utterly crazy and ignorant, and his version of the irreducible complexity argument is bizarre, even for that mess of an argument. And another summary of the debate, and lots of summaries, and this is kind of typical. Diagnosis of me: I'm a typical village idiot, I'll get it, despicably, that's not a word I use a lot, honest, dishonest, crazy, paranoid, wingnut, and kook. Another extreme case of confirmation bias and persecution complex. His ardent efforts seem to have gained him some level of influence among his peers, and he is a medium threat to school curricula everywhere. Not only me, but one of my colleagues I work with, Kevin Worth, and you can see they have, again, nasty things to say about him as well. And so moving on to skip some of these, my book, Fossil Forensics, got 92 global ratings. Here's a letter lambasting me in the magazine. And this is a bunch of people, pictures of my nemesis, who I like as a person, and Useless Organs, book I wrote, which is in Arabic. And I can mention Ben Stein's film Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed. Excellent film, did a really good job showing the discrimination against creationists was a pervasive problem. And what happened in the film? Well, this is the only film I know that has ever been sued to bankruptcy. This was sued by Yoko Ono, John Lennon's wife. And she basically, the goal was to bankrupt the film, and that worked. He had in the film, I think 20 seconds or 19 seconds of John Lennon's film about religion. And so she sued. It was legal. It's clearly legal. But Yoko Ono didn't care. She wanted to bankrupt the film, and she did so. And so the film was put up for auction, and the studio that produced it was bankrupt. And so even to produce a film, well-directed, well-financed film, you can end up in problems. This is Slaughter of the Distance book, another Silencing the Darwin Skeptics, Censoring the Darwin Skeptics, and Lynching of a Darwin Skeptic, Trials of a Darwin Doubter. And these are some of the books that I wrote which deal with this issue. And the effect on me, I was married for 10 years. This was my wife when I was teaching at Bowling Green State University. And the turmoil, I was not in a good mood, to be honest, during this time period. And I was working very hard, and my wife couldn't take it anymore. And she left, and that's a picture of her about a month after she left, and my two beautiful children. And that was extremely difficult to deal with. There's my daughter and my son. My son, by the way, will have nothing to do with me because I'm one of these creationists, and we can't associate with such people. And wasn't there during when he was growing up. And of course, he wasn't there because the divorce, and I was trying to survive making a living. And my ex-wife, her husband's name was Balikowski, and so she was Maria Balikowski, her ex-husband, but she was married to him after she left me. She made it very clear. She did an affidavit and stated the reason she thought a divorce was the situation was severely exacerbated by the conflicts Gerald was having with the university, namely his struggles to achieve tenure, working on committees, writing publication, doing research to the point where the family was severely neglected. In addition to the obvious stress, my ex-husband of his struggle with the university took its toll on our relationship. Further, I was doing a tremendous amount of his typing, which the university should have completed for the university in his efforts to achieve tenure, often up to 2 and 3 hours a night. Thus, while his factor was not the sole determination determinant of my decision. It was clearly a major factor. And that, of course, is very, very difficult for me to deal with, needless to say. And so it goes well beyond not only me, but the others. To try to summarize, a friend of mine summarized all of this, and he said, well, this conforms my conclusion. My conclusion is there's two basic worldviews. One worldview is evolution, and worldview explains where we came from, why we're here, where we're going. Evolution says where we came from, we evolved, why we're here to survive, where we're going, when we die, we die. The other, the religious, so-called religious worldview is why are we, where we come from, God created us, why are we here? To serve God and our fellow man. Where are we going? When we die, we go to heaven or hell. And so very different worldviews. And so clearly evolution is a worldview. And my friend mentioned, really, it's a worldview. It's also a religion. And so you could classify worldview as a religion. And so evolution, I still got used to that, but he insists on this. So the religion of evolution is the problem. And he said further, I find evolution is a cult, has a lot of traits like a cult. And this behavior, which he's aware of from his reading of his own work and my work as well, this behavior is intolerable. They are intolerable against those that oppose, and they want to basically run the show, and they want to disown or eliminate or harm or whatever they can to those that question their worldview and their religion. He says their cult. That's why he calls them a cult. And therefore, it's a problem. And unfortunately, tragically, at least the American government, I don't know about Canada, but at least the American government is basically sided with one religion. And so we have a state religion, and that state religion is evolutionary naturalism, I guess you could call. So anyways, I have a lot more slides, but I'm sure there's some questions. And if we, no, it's just still there.
Dr. Bergman, we are still here. This
Okay.
presentation is flying by with a lot of comments and a lot of comments expressing the shock at how creationist scientists have been treated, like yourself. But
I need to mention, I did remarry. I have an incredibly wonderful wife. Never changed places at all. But, I was a mopey guy for about 6 years trying to deal with the loss of my family. That was very difficult for me, but I was very fortunate. I guess in many ways, my friends tell me, you're really fortunate in love and marriage. And even in your work in the universities, a friend told me, I have a friend, he's had 3 university jobs, and none of them lasted more than a year. And now he drives a truck. And so, Bergman, don't complain. You've spent most of your life teaching at colleges and universities. You've had some good experiences. Quit complaining. And so I have to realize, yeah, he's right. I've got a good marriage. I've got had a great career. I had really enjoyed enormously my students at Northwest State and at the medical school. And so I don't like to complain, but I think I needed to respond to Gutsick. But anyways,
Absolutely.
Okay, go ahead.
No, that's completely reasonable. I like what you said there. The Bible says that all things work together for good to them that love God and to them that are called according to his purpose. So all of this worked out for the best, for the good, and not only for the good of you, but the good of the body of Christ, because your work has been such a blessing. And you've seen both sides, Dr. Bergman. So you're able to come at this from a totally different angle with a completely different strategy, because you were an evolutionist atheist at one point. You experienced that life, and the evidence that you provided is overwhelmingly against what the critics say in terms of how they misrepresent your credentials. You put that to bed, Dr. Bergman, how they misrepresent your testimony. I mean, those first several slides where you were just giving the evidence, the historical evidence when you were an atheist and you were represented. Could you reiterate those points? Because it looked like, and your slides are moving quick, where you had some pictures where you were being represented or highlighted in the atheist foundation that you were part of in the past before you converted. Is that right, Jerry?
Oh, yeah. Marilyn Murray O'Hara, she said they had a coup in getting me. That's what the
Wow.
word she used. They had a coup. And she, I have a feeling she published everything I wrote, not because everything was really super good, but because she was just proud to have me on board. She never said that, but she was proud to have me on board. And she liked just a couple of things she published of mine. Not the best work. And I think she was very accommodating because she felt we've caught one. We've got one of these former Christians who are articulate and bright and aware and published a lot. And therefore, we don't want to alienate. Of course, they eventually did alienate me, but I have to admit I got along really well with the atheists until I became a heretic, and now
Right.
they won't answer my letters.
Nor will they debunk your arguments against their position.
Yeah, they want nothing to do with me now. So,
wow. So when you converted, how was your experience for that time period after your conversion with a lot of those friends and colleagues that held to the atheistic evolutionary worldview? Would you have some good discussions and kind of mini debates with them to help them maybe open their eyes in the same way that your eyes were open, Jerry?
I did with some, but you have to remember all the universities I've taught at, except Spring Arbor, which is a Christian school, but all the other universities I taught at most of them were atheists, or almost all of them were atheists. Now, I didn't go around asking, and usually we don't like to use that word. Most wouldn't walk up and say, I'm an atheist. But on the other hand, I knew most of them were atheists. That was pretty obvious. Right. So, and I got along really well with them. I never had hardly any except Richard Burke at Bowling Green State University. Richard Burke I shouldn't say I'm upset at him, but he had married and had a wife, he had 3 kids, and he decided he was gay, and he dumped his wife, and he moved in with his gay partner, and they're both dead now, by the way. But I thought, to abandon your family, and she cried, his wife, in my arms. She just couldn't deal with losing her husband, and he was having sex with me all these years, and I was thinking of guys, and I don't know if that's true, but that's what she said. And what about his children? What about his children? What about them? And she just felt that was just really selfish. And she said she had a good friend who was an accident, it was impotent or something, and they didn't divorce just because he was impotent. I mean, that was a part of the marriage, but that's not, when you have a wife and kids, that's the most important part of the marriage. And she just couldn't understand it. And she was a nice lady, and tried to commensurate with her. We were a couple of times, and I didn't talk to her a lot about this, but just a couple of times when she was really upset over him leaving. And he was the one that seemed to be most antagonistic, leading the parade against me at the Bowling Green State University. And so, and I never talked about homosexuality with him or anybody else. When I was teaching at the university, it wasn't an issue. I guess since I taught psychology, I did have a couple of my colleagues state what do they think caused it, and I said, well, it's early life experiences. And they said, yeah, that's what I thought too. And so that's about the extent of conversations at the university, because they all agreed with me. It's just, that was the feeling back then. It's caused by early life experiences. And that's what I learned since then. And that's what I still believe. But on the other hand, and again, it just wasn't an issue at the university. And I don't know if you disagree with me. I never talked about that with Richard. So I never talked about almost anything with Richard, but it was clear. I think he knew where I was coming from, and that's why he hated me. I'm sure he knew that, because the issue of religion came up over and over at the university. I get magazines at the university and with religious contents, and they knew I published that Phi Kappa monograph, and they knew I'd published in a number of religious journals. And so, they knew that. So it wasn't a secret. I was on the front page of the newspapers. And in fact, I think I've been on the front page of like 5 different papers. So it's out there.
And so you showed the evidence in your slides, the pictures of yourself, and also the quotes, all of those excerpts, not only from the trial, but from colleagues, those that you worked with, expressing in many ways the respect that they had for you, talking about how diligent you were with the articles that you wrote and your publications and your qualifications. And it's all there for the skeptics to see in this presentation. And so I'm wondering, in light of everything you presented there, Jerry, which is so important. So for anybody just joining us, definitely go back and watch the entire presentation, because there's a lot of important points there on the reality of Christian persecution, especially in the world of education. But if somebody were wondering, they come across this video from Gutsick Gibbon, who you debated here for many hours. I think the debate was almost 5 hours as a marathon, at least 4. And this video, almost a couple hours, titled "Debunking Creationist Jerry Bergman," since I'm debating him tomorrow. So she put that out a day or two before your actual formal debate with her. If you had to provide a summary in terms of what she said that was wrong in terms of your testimony, your past, your credentials, what kind of summary would you provide a person who has watched the video and they're curious how truthful it is, Jerry?
Well, number one, she's out to win debates, and her YouTube, she's gotten several awards for thousands of people who, in fact, I have a copy right here. She has huge numbers of. So, she's very popular among the atheists and evolutionists. Here we got 86,000 views, 2,373 comments. And I didn't read all those comments, but I read a number of them, and this is kind of a flavor. After hearing Dr. Bergman talk, I understand why we haven't cured cancer. There's one. I feel this was like 25% debate and 75% therapy session for Dr. Bergman's persecution complex. And again, I would say 90% of them are negative, name calling. And I just have a hard time with this for several reasons. Number one, you have good arguments and present your arguments. Number two, when you start name calling, you descend to name calling. I think that's a problem, and making fun of. And their common response is, as you've seen from the quotes a few that I've read online here, the name calling is a problem. And I guess I have a hard time respecting people who don't look at both sides. And she mentioned Ron Numbers was trying to debunk my work. And that's disappointing, because I always liked Ron Numbers, and I corresponded with him quite a bit. And he was fairly accurate. He was a creationist. His father was a Seventh-day Adventist minister. And so I always liked him. He was somewhat sympathetic, and I read a lot of his books. And it's disappointing that he would say nasty things about me and never contacted me. I mean, that's basic 101 journalism. When you write about somebody, you contact them, you give them a chance to respond. And if they don't respond, well, that's one thing, but he's never contacted me. And I have 6 file cabinets full of documentation of what I'm saying. I mean, I have literature, that enormous amount of emails and articles and affidavits and court documents and so on. I have huge amount. All he has to do is ask me, could you answer this question, and could you respond? I would invite him over to my house. He can stay here, and he can spend hours and hours going through my files if he wants to. By the way, Ron Numbers gave his library, his research library, to Adventist University, which I find interesting. That it seems some of these staunch atheists seems to renege as they get older. I understand that one of the main head of the Skeptics Society, who used to be an atheist, is now only a agnostic. He's moving in the other direction, which surprised me. I'm trying to think of his name, but anyway, he's the head of the Skeptics Society. He publishes a magazine, The Skeptics. But Michael Shermer, there he is. Michael Shermer, the staunch atheist, is now, I'm softening my position. Maybe there's a God. I'm moving in that direction. That surprised me, because he was a very staunch atheist. Well, still head of the Skeptics Society. So he spends his life writing articles against us.
Well, perhaps there can be a Michael Shermer versus Dr. Jerry Bergman debate one day on the evidence for the evolutionary worldview. And so I think it's important anytime that we come across uh, whether it's a video or something in writing that's attacking a person's credentials or attacking them personally, whatever it is. I think, as you said, journalism 101. Why don't you go talk to the person first, ask some questions, how true it is, have them explain themselves if they can, rather than just assuming what's being said is true or 100% factual. And so, Jerry, as we move into perhaps some of these more creation versus evolution related topics, perhaps a good place to start with Erica's video there, some of the more scientific lines of art. And you guys had a great, respectful, professional debate. I really enjoyed that exchange. Erica and Dr. Peter Lyon had a great debate as well. What are your thoughts on her point dealing with overall human chimp DNA similarity, where one methodology would put humans and chimps in terms of overall DNA similarity between 96 and maybe 98%. But then if you go with another methodology that considers everything, copy number variation, size differences, gaps, unalignable regions, you get a lower number, maybe 84%. But she points out that if you go with the methodology that gives you a lower number, everything else that you compare in the biological world, including humans to humans or intra-species variation within gorillas, is also a lot less. And so, in your opinion, I'm curious, what are your thoughts as creationists then? Should we be consistent? That if we say, well, overall DNA similarity is more like 84%, but if we go with that methodology that gives the 84% number, then we do have to admit that other creatures that we might even agree are related in the created kinds model are also a lot different, Jerry.
Even if they're only 2% different, 2% of 3 billion is a lot, a big number. And it's difficult to make comparisons based on DNA amount, DNA chromosome number, as well as DNA amount. And when you look at I don't have a chart with me, but I need to start working on a chart. And you find we are so similar in many ways to animals that we would be so different from. And yet we are so different from animals, which in so many ways are so similar to us genetically. One of the most interesting areas is that all the so-called junk DNA. And the junk DNA, of course, was junk DNA for 98% was junk DNA. Now, as time goes on, we're finding more and more uses of them. And one use is that you can have 2 or 3 DNA differences or two or 3 areas of the DNA that's different. And that can affect the whole thing, because it's like having 1,000 pictures and you pull one picture out and it gives you a whole different view of other pictures. And so we're talking about one genetic control, which pulls out a set of genes. And so in many ways, what we see is the genes, the information's there and it has to be put together. It's like having a book and all the pages are there, but we have to put all the pages together to make the book. And so in many ways, we have to assemble the parts. And it doesn't take many parts to assemble all the other parts to produce the differences. And so I think comparing DNA differences is very limited. It's useful, but very limited. And again, we still have a lot to learn about DNA, and we are learning a lot about DNA. But when you look at the differences between humans and chimps in other areas, behavioral differences, thought differences, mind differences, speech differences, you find a huge difference just looking at the morphological differences, behavioral differences, and so on. Enormous number of differences. And of course, you find similarities. It always surprises me how close we are to some animals, but yet we're so different genetically from some animals. For example, studies have shown that a good companion, a good therapist for certain people, like autistic people, is horses. Horses, you would expect, would be a good therapist. Horses are very different from us. Well, in some ways, they're very similar. In some ways, dogs are very similar to us. How empathetic they are, how in many ways very different, but in many ways very, very similar. So it's complex and interesting. And again, I've had to spend most of my life, most of my days, most of my life period with evolutionists. And so I get along quite well with them. I've had very few problems, partially because at work, we're not concerned about, believe it or not, creation evolution. At the medical school, I have 3 degrees from medical school and spent a number of years there working and teaching and doing research. And yet my entire time there, degrees, working with colleagues, evolution was never, ever mentioned. So when they say that evolution is the foundation for science, for everything, for biology, it was never mentioned. I was mentioned once. I had, not directly, but indirectly. I had a professor talked about the hyoid bone, got a nice long lecture on 45-minute lecture on the hyoid bone. And he concluded this lecture with, whoever designed this sure knew what he was doing. That's all he said. That's the only comment I ever remember in hours and hours and hours of classes I had there and teaching and so on and working with colleagues. That's the only comment that was ever made. So when you talk about evolution as the foundation for science, for medicine especially, just not true. It's not the foundation. Again, if it was mentioned, boy, I'd perk right up and I would never forget it.
Well, I love that answer for so many reasons, Jerry. There's a few things I'd like to say and follow up. But firstly, I like to say it's the differences that make all the difference. There are a lot of complex differences. There's even between humans and chimps within similar sequences. Within those similar sequences, there's differences in terms of how those genes are regulated, turned on, turn off, how they're expressed. And so the most important differences, I think, between human and chimp genomes are the gene interaction networks. Which genes are turned on at what time and how much, or how little are they turned on? A lot of genetic level discontinuities. But one point that you made there with the healthcare advancing in terms of medicine, for example, if you could, because you have experience in this world of healthcare and just health sciences in general. I debated a PhD microbiologist or molecular biologist last week on another debate channel. And one of his main arguments was, okay, you've got all these pieces of evidence or arguments against evolution, right, Jerry? But he's saying, and he's got a patent or two, and he does a lot of work himself, I guess, in his field in, I think, medicine and focusing on viruses and bacteria and stuff. And so he's saying, where is the creationist view? How are these creationist arguments advancing in healthcare, for example, or health sciences, or our knowledge of the world of biology in general? He's basically asserting that it's the evolutionary worldview that allows us to advance in these fields. Is that really the case, Dr. Bergman?
I think it's in many ways the opposite. I see over and over that evolution gets in the way. We have evolution glasses. We see the world in a distorted way with those evolution glasses. And I think we need to take those glasses off and we need to look at reality. Just evaluate what reality is out there and not starting wearing the evolution glasses and start seeing things through those glasses. I have 2,000 articles online. I have to wonder how many evolutionists read those. My guess is not many, very few, number one. Number two, my guess is if they read them to find out what's wrong with them. So you take an article I wrote and they say, okay, what's wrong with this? Bergman's trying to disprove evolution, trying to prove creation. I've got to find something wrong with them. So their worldview dominates what they think and what they write when they read my articles. And when we talk about the evidence for creation, again, people Gutsick Gibbon I wonder how many, my guess is she hasn't read a single article that I've written, not a single article. And if she would, I'm sure she would read them with a goal of trying to find out what's wrong with them. So she sees the world through evolutionary glasses, and that distorts it. And I don't need any glasses. I just look at the world and see it the way it is. Often when I look at the world, look at the biological design of somebody, it's pretty obvious that it was designed and exists for a reason. I just read an article on the vagus nerve. And it's amazing how well designed that is. And evolution can't even begin to explain it. And I looked for articles, did internet searches, trying to find articles which explain the evolution of the vagus nerve from a non-vagus nerve, and no one had a clue. They couple speculated on how it could have been, but nothing more than a few sentences. Well, we know that invertebrates have a certain system and it must be evolved to become a vertebrate. This is what must take place. But they don't have a clue as to how the vagus nerve could have evaluated. But yeah, it's critical. Without the vagus nerve, you wouldn't have vertebrates, period. You got to have that. It's irreducibly complex. You have to have a vagus nerve in order to have a vertebrate animal, period. Has to be there. Has to be there fully developed. It cannot evolve. And of course, the evolutionists don't see it that way. They see it, how did it evolve? It did. We know it did. Now, how did it evolve? We can't figure it out. We have no idea. But we must be able to figure it out. And the fact is, and I was trying to find articles who had it figured out so I could quote them. And I looked and corresponded with friends and said, can you find an article which postulates, which guesses how the vagus nerve could evolve? None of them could find a single article, not a single article. So here I'm writing an article about the vagus nerve, the evolution, and the section on the evolution of the vagus nerve. Well, I couldn't find anything. And I had to then spend some time showing you. I did a AI search, and I asked specifically, can you find some articles which show how the vagus nerve evolved? And the AI responded, well, we can't, but we're working on it. And so I had to quote AI. I don't want what the reviewers might think, but they might say, look, you can't quote AI. But I could not find any articles. And my perception is that fellow creationists will say, well, why don't you look harder? The reviewers will look at this and say, you couldn't find the articles to refute. Well, look harder. So reject this and tell the author it's a good start. Try to find articles which postulate some plausible mechanism as how the vagus nerve could evolve. I hope they don't say that, but I realize they could. The article could be rejected because I could not find anything that defended the evolutionary worldview. And we'll see. I'll let you know whether it's accepted, but if it's rejected, well, then I'll just submit it to another creation journals. I can mention 2 creation journals. In many ways, I found they're more rigid than secular journals. And I'll give you an example. I did an article about an event recently, and this school was a school named after an astronaut, a creation astronaut, named after him, and they banned teaching intelligent design and creation. And I wrote, this is ironic, where you've got a school named after a open, well-known creationist, and yet they can't teach creationism. Isn't this ironic? So in doing the article, I quoted a Hebrew scholar. And so they had reviewers, and boy, they checked every single reference. They checked every single, and I had to have everything referred. I mentioned a couple of things, and they said, you need a reference. You need to support this. So I found references and supported it. And then my Hebrew, they said, well, our Hebrew scholar who looked at your article, there's one sentence in there about Hebrew. My Hebrew scholar that looked at your article questioned whether or not, where did you get this interpretation of this Hebrew word? And so I just relied on somebody else. I don't know Hebrew. And so what I did was I found on the internet, I found some Hebrew scholars that accepted my interpretation of that Hebrew word. And I said, well, I don't know. I'm not a Hebrew scholar. I studied Greek in college, and so I can't talk about Hebrew much, but this is what other scholars have said. And so, if you can't accept it, then just pull out the sentence and we'll just go without it. But we'll see what she says. But on the other hand, I'm just amazed at how thorough creation reviewers are. Evolutionists make fun of these reviewers, but in my experience, and I've done plenty of secular articles, in my experience as a whole, they are much more rigorous, partially because they're concerned about critics.
Right.
And so they're concerned about a problem.
Well, you made a lot of good points there. The vagus nerve, they've got no shortage of stories. And I've got one pulled up here. Firstly, the vagus nerve, being the longest cranial nerve in the body, connects the brain stem to the heart, lungs, and digestive tract. And so how did something like this evolve if not designed? And then the evolutionists say, well, the vagus nerve evolved over hundreds of millions of years, right? So long ago and far away, there's their fairy tale, Jerry. And then they assert, originating as a primitive gill arch in visceral control circuit in early fish, and expanding into a complex system for social engagement in mammals. Now, is this assertion based on actual empirical scientific evidence, Jerry,
Well,
or is
no, it
this
isn't.
just
And
their story?
no, it isn't. And I didn't use that because that's too far-fetched.
Yeah,
I'm sure
that's a
critics will say,
wild one.
you're quoting this guy. Now, come on, Bergman. You can't quote this. This guy's got this way off about a fish design. This is irresponsible. So maybe I could use it. I don't know. Maybe you could let me know what that is. And if it's turned down, the journal I submitted to, maybe I'll, add that assertion. But yeah, they were some really far-fetched. And I just didn't want to quote. That sounds almost silly. And so I'm afraid I might be criticized for evolutionists will say it's just you're finding some way offbeat explanation, and that's just irresponsible to include that in your article. But I don't know. But that's an interesting. Maybe you can send me the information on that, and I can.
I didn't find it in any sophisticated way. Andrew Cummings, he said, well, what is he quoting? I just Googled, how did the vagus nerve evolve? And then that's what popped up. So, no shortage of, but I'll see which scientific article, or if we can find that in a technical paper of some kind. But that is what you'll find, Jerry, when it comes to a lot of these sophisticated systems. How did these evolve over time? Mutually interdependent systems, I like. Jerry, we could talk about several. One specifically that's relatively easy to understand is you've got DNA and DNA repair enzymes. It's said that in a single day in a single cell, we can experience up to 1 million DNA breaks. And we've got, 60 to 70 trillion cells in our bodies. But thankfully, we've got these incredibly designed DNA repair enzymes that go in and fix a lot of these DNA breaks, or else we'd go extinct, or our species would die off in a couple generations. The problem for the evolutionists is, and as you know, Jerry, there's tons of these mutually interdependent systems that they can't explain, is the information for those DNA repair enzymes are encoded in the DNA. So what came first, the DNA or the DNA repair enzymes? But to the atheists in the chat, perhaps you can give me an answer to this. You need the DNA repair enzymes to fix the DNA breaks. You also need the DNA to encode for the information for the DNA repair enzymes. So how do these kinds of systems evolve, Jerry, if evolution is true?
Well, yeah, they would say, well, you just don't have faith. You don't have faith in. Right. I mentioned this a lot, the repair enzymes. Basically, life is designed not to evolve. And I mentioned that the repair enzymes, typically 99.9% are repaired. And I mentioned that, and they go on to something else, like they'll show comparisons between chimps and humans. And while chimps and humans, the similarities in certain toes are similar in chimps and humans, and therefore they go on to these other things, which, and that's, I guess, I had a problem with Gutsick Gibbon. He brought trivial things up, which I thought are interesting and we should look at. And I don't want to criticize them as being trivial, but I think they were. The core is you have to have a means of producing new viable genetic information. And that's the problem Darwin had, and that's the problem we had all throughout history, and that's the problem we still have. You don't have the foundation for evolution if you have no means of producing genetic variety. I know they come up with gene flow and so on. They come up with some explanations which may account for 1 or 2% or small numbers, or may not account for any at all. And they can't explain the origin of genetic information. Right. Natural selection, I mean, that's no problem. That's obviously natural selection is true, and no one denies that. But the problem is, as you know, not the survival of the fittest. The problem is the arrival of the fittest. And they change the subject, or they call you, you're a jerk, you're stupid. They call you names. And I guess it's hard for me to communicate with people like that because it's not productive. And I just don't expect highly educated people to resort to that. Like the comments from, and I didn't print them all off, but I printed a lot of them off in of the debate that I had with Gutsick and the 2,373 comments. After reading 80 or 90, I thought, they're pretty much all the same. It's just name calling.
Right.
Ignorant name calling.
It's the evolutionist soundboard. It's eventually it's just it's repetition. It's the same thing they're saying over and over again.
Yeah.
Well, Andrew Cumming here's interesting because we got some critics in the chat, Jerry. So I like to pose these challenges and see their response. And see, he says, this is just the DNA, protein, chicken and egg. It's not, see, they try to minimize it. No, it's not just that. These are major questions and challenges that if we don't have a good scientific answer, well, then the entire evolutionary story from abiogenesis to the origin of genetic information, like you said, Jerry, of all life on the planet, is not science. It's something they believe in. It's evolutionary philosophy, sure, but not science. But he says, which is why the RNA world hypothesis was proposed and tested. Yeah, it was proposed and tested, but it was shown that RNA breaks down very quickly in water. It's fragile structure. There's a lot of problems, isn't that right, Jerry? With not only the RNA world hypothesis, but all of your so-called hypotheses in explaining the origin of life, they've got their own suite of problems.
Yeah, the RNA has to break down quickly. Otherwise, you'd end up with overproduction of certain proteins. So when RNA is in the cell, it does deliberately break down quickly because you need a means of controlling the product of that gene. And if you have RNA, which just survives for a long period of time, you end up with overproducing a certain protein, and that's a problem. And so the RNA has to be able to break down relatively quickly. It has a lifespan, and that's one means of controlling. If you want more of whatever the RNA is producing, you produce more RNA. But that's the regulation system that's required. So it's pretty clear to me that evolutionists are slowly disproving their own theory.
Right.
And it's just nice that somebody could come forward, and this is why we have to reach the young people. Somebody could come forward and say, look, we've got a problem here. We've got this theory which is blocking knowledge. It's getting in the way of understanding knowledge. It's not really that helpful in most cases. I mean, I know that evolution has inspired some good research, and that's fine. But by and large, I think it stifles looking at the true cause.
Well, I've got a paper pulled up here, and it's been a while since I looked at it in detail, but it's from the conventional literature. As you've said, the evolutionists refute themselves. We can refute their arguments and challenges directly from their own literature, which is incredible. But it's called, and I put it in the chat, the RNA world hypothesis, the worst theory of the early evolution of life, except for all the others. So, I mean, I've seen papers in the conventional literature on the topic of not only the origin of biodiversity in the world of evolution, but with the origin of life, where there's competing hypotheses and they're all attacking each other's hypothesis, as in pointing out all these issues. And we as a creationists, we would say, yeah, the reason why they can point out to so many different issues on all these different origin of life hypotheses is because none of them are true, Jerry. God created life. But these evolutionary science, these secular scientists are not even asking that question, are they?
Right. And that's another problem with the evolutionary worldview. It's blocking out one whole method of learning about the world. And that's a problem. It's where you're wearing evolution glasses. You don't see the whole world the way it is. It distorts the world. And but again, more and more, I agree with my friend who says evolution's a religion. And I guess as I think about it, more and more it is. Not only a religion, but it's a cultic religion and a harmful religion, and gets in the way of finding out knowledge and finding answers to genuine questions, or at least it poses false questions. One answer I heard over and over in school was, well, what explains this? Well, evolution does. Well, how did evolution do it? Well, evolution explains it. Don't know exactly how, but we're working on that. So you get people that explain away problems by saying, well, evolution did it that way, or natural selection caused it to be that way. But why is it that way? Well, natural selection, that's causing it more likely to survive with this design, and therefore that's why that design dominates.
And isn't that aren't their answers assuming that selection can do the job that they wanted to do, and mutations can provide the necessary raw material for selection to act upon? You said something earlier, Jerry, that I wanted to touch on, because I asked you a question regarding one of the primary arguments this microbiologist was using against me in a formal debate. But you pointed out that you think the evolutionary model of the worldview actually hinders scientific advancement rather than helps with the positive progress of it, because you pointed to junk DNA. And I think that's a really good point. Junk DNA is junk science. We as creationists, wouldn't we expect treasure in the genomes of living organisms, or when we're studying humans? But evolutionists, the mindset is, well, the majority of the genome is junk. It comprises viral fossils, genetic mistakes like pseudogenes, and essentially evolutionary leftovers. And that thinking hinders scientific advancement, including in the world of medicine.
Yeah, very much so. And that's the best illustration of the vestigial organ argument, which it hindered.
Good point.
Science. Instead of asking, what does this do? We said, well, it's a useless organ and doesn't do anything, and it doesn't do it because of evolution, and therefore, end of story. And so it gets in the way of, in this case, especially in the way of finding out answers to questions. And the answers were finally found out, but it took a while. People had to say, wait a minute, yes, it's a useless organ, but maybe it isn't. Maybe it has a use. And so the brave people went beyond this useless organ idea and basically did find it has uses. And of course, now we know all the so-called vestigial organs have very important uses, without exception.
But Jerry, and I'm pretending to be an evolutionist here, this is what they've said. But Jerry, we never once said that vestigial means non-functional, completely functionless. A vestigial organ could be an organ that had one function in an evolutionary ancestor, but now it's just co-opted, or it's shifted towards a different function over time.
Yeah, my response is read the old evolution books. That's why I collect old books. And I have tons of old evolution books which were published 50, 100, 150 years ago. And you just look in them and they make it very clear these are useless. They have no function whatsoever. And that was accepted for decades.
Wow.
And so I find it fascinating, because so much of the evolution for the evidence for human evolution has now all been refuted. I have an article a book actually I was looking at, which is published, I think, around 1920 or 30. And every single one of the claims for our evolutionary ancestors now have all been proven as not our evolutionary ancestors or extinct apes, period. So none of them are accepted. They've all been rejected. And so it's one thing, reason I like older evolution books, because so much of what they said is just simply wrong, and embarrassingly wrong, especially the books that would talk about racism. The evolution books that talk about in a serious way racism.
Is this a case in many ways of historical revisionism? I just typed into Google Dr. Jerry Bergman vestigial organs, and there's several articles that you've produced over the years. You've given presentations, evolution's blunders, one of them vestigial structures. So is that a case of historical revisionism, where now, because we have documented, identified functions for the so-called 140 or whatever vestigial structures and organs, appendix, coccyx, goosebumps, you name the tonsils, you name it. So now they're pivoting. Well, we never said that they were completely functionless, but you've documented directly from their textbooks where, yes, they've used that wording. That's
right.
Their philosophy, that these are completely without function.
Yeah. Again, the evolutionary worldview dominates their conclusions, and therefore they have to come up with a conclusion that still accepts the vestigial organ idea. So they say, well, we really didn't mean totally useless. We mean it had a different use. And therefore, evolution is still true, and vestigial organs are still such, but they don't do what we maybe thought they did 100 years ago. So yeah, the evolutionary worldview dominates the way they look at the world. Where creationists have the advantage where we don't dominate. We don't see the world through our creation or our evolution worldview. We just see the world, and then when we understand the world, then we interpret that as being a result of creation, which it often logically is.
Because we use experiment or study mice in the lab to discover new medicines for diseases and health problems, and we can understand our own biology through species that we share similarities with, like mice. They're mammals. Taxonomically, they'll say they're mammals. We got some DNA similarities, so we can use them as test agents, essentially. So doesn't that point to the brilliance of God when they ask, well, why did God create in homologous or nested hierarchical patterns? Why do we have these DNA similarities? Well, if we didn't, then we couldn't actually, and maybe you can speak to this, Jerry, this just came to mind based on what we're discussing. We couldn't advance in the way we do in science, in medicine, and in health, and just understanding our biological systems better if God did not create the biological world with these similarities.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point. And we should look at the world for what it is. One major thing that this tells me is that God loves variety, like we do too.
Right.
Clothes around our house. I don't know if I have any two shirts that are identical. Few, but by and large, looking at my clothes, my closet, they're all different. And when my wife buys new clothes, she makes sure she buys clothes that are different because we like variety. And I collect model cars. I've got model cars all over the house. And I have a lot of different cars. I don't have 5 models of the same car, although I have several models of the same car that are different colors. But still, I like models, and I like to get models of different years of cars, different kinds of cars, different Mopars and some Corvettes and different cars. That's what I enjoy. Same with other things. I like differences, and God enormously likes differences in the world, and that's why one reason we see all these differences.
Well, I find it interesting with what you said is we as humans, we love variety. You pointed out, and no two of your shirts are the same, right? And I'm kind of the same way, although I've got, 6 or 7 of these same SFT blue shirts, but I also got a variety too, but also with cars. And so Andrew says here, that doesn't necessitate, excuse me, that he organizes similarities such that they form a nested hierarchy. But my thoughts are this, and then Jerry, I want to hand it to you, is the reality that we as humans design things like modes of transportation, let's say, vehicles with similarities and differences. Take any manufacturer, they're going to have sedans, hatchbacks, SUVs, vans, or just modes of transportation in general, bringing airplanes and boats. Aren't human engineers designing in a pattern by accident, nested hierarchies? Take a sedan. A sedan is more similar to a hatchback than it is to an SUV, a van, a boat, or a skateboard. So accidentally, just us designing things, these design modes of transportations are falling out into this hierarchy. So God designing the biological world with both similarities and differences, we therefore expect that there would be hierarchies where, let's say, humans, we look a lot more similar to a chimp than we do to an old world monkey, a dog, fish, or bacteria. Isn't that just pointing to hierarchies by design, Jerry?
Yeah, I think the nested hierarchy idea is a good idea, but you can do a lot of things. You can form nested hierarchies, clothes, cars, so many things that you can form really nice nested hierarchies very effectively. I guess with cars, you could 10, 15 years ago, you could form a lot of really nice nested hierarchies. Today, there's not many. They all look like, 4-door hardtop, 4-door, what do they call that? The 4-door, not a sedan, but 4-door.
Well, like a lot of bigger vehicles now, like SUVs and crossovers and
the family car. What do they call that?
Right, the family, either minivan or SUV. Like I have a van, but
they all look pretty much the same.
Yeah. Well, now, yeah, if you go to Chryslers now, for example, when I was growing up, my first car was a nice Chrysler 200. My parents had a Dodge Charger, Chrysler 300. But now you go and it's all the bigger family vehicles. That's the popular thing now, right?
Right. You don't have the nested hierarchies. 30 years ago, you had Volkswagens, you had a PT Cruiser, you had a lot of cars that were very different from other cars. And today, I understand that the vast majority of cars that our people buy are the family car. The I can't remember the name of it, but they all look pretty much the same. There's a joke. How can you tell a Volkswagen from a Chrysler? Well, a Volkswagen has in the front a round circle and some W's there. A Chrysler has a different symbol. So that is the basic difference between so many of the cars is the symbol they use to represent the car. So many of them look so much similar. A friend of mine bought a Porsche I looked at it and that looks just like a Jeep. I mean, why should you buy a Porsche now that looks just like? And I looked at the inside. I opened the door and I said, it says Porsche here. It says it's a Porsche, but to me, this looks just like a Jeep. One of the newer Jeeps, with not the old Army kind, but the newer Jeeps. And I wonder why. And the same thing with Volkswagen. Why do all these cars look the same? So for some reason, nested hierarchy has been lost in cars. But
Well,
among so many things, you can get nested hierarchies.
Well, it's interesting too, because even with Volkswagen and with this push or leaning towards more family-centered vehicles like these crossover SUVs, take any manufacturer like Volkswagen, you still got your Jetta, your Passat, your Tiguan, your Atlas. Your Atlas is your bigger SUV. And so even with that push more towards bigger family vehicles, you still could take, even though your sedans and your smaller vehicles are less sought out, I guess you could say, than the bigger SUVs, you're still going to find kind of a hierarchy from your sedan type, like your Volkswagen Jetta and your Passat, to your Tiguan and your Atlas. But to your point, I think this is a powerful point, Jerry, is with the invention of a lot of these crossover SUVs, these family vehicles, the thinking is, well, okay, you've got a van and then a strict SUV. But human engineers are like, well, wait a minute. If we combine the traits of both, then we get something that meets the best of both worlds. And so these crossover SUVs are really popular now, but they're not quite an SUV, Jerry. They're not quite a van. But don't we see that same thing in the biological world, where we find a lot of these interesting mosaics, or what evolutionists say are transitional forms, Tiktaalik, mammal-like reptiles, Archaeopteryx? So human engineers, we're designed in the image of God. And so we're getting a sense for how God designed based on the way we design things. And we're designing with these patterns. I just find that to be incredible, how it matches up really in many ways to the biological world.
Oh yeah, I agree. It does. And I can see that there's everyone does not want to buy SUV. There are some people who, for various reasons, want to buy another kind of car. I'm surprised at Corvette-like cars. I've seen 2 or 3 of them. I have a friend of mine that bought one, and I said, "Is this a Corvette?" "No, this isn't a Corvette. It was, I forget which, it was a Corvair, I think, but it was a new car, and it looks just like, well, similar to a Corvette to me. And so there's still a market for certain other cars. So we still, I guess, today have a nested hierarchy, maybe not as much as we had in the past, but we still have the similarities.
I was laughing at some of the comments here, the critics. So
what do the critics say? I'm curious.
Well, we've got a lot of them. So we've got Dr. Dan Stern-Cardy now, Great Schmitz, who you debated in the past, but he's kind of teasing me a little bit more. He's saying, I click on Bergman and I hear Donny talking about Volkswagens, finally sticking to his expertise. It's kind of, he's teasing me because I used to sell Volkswagen vehicles, so I know a thing or two about them, Jerry. And that's why we get to look at the design world and see how that relates to the design in the biological world. Because, Jerry, that is a main argument that the critics use. And so if you're talking to a skeptic and they're asking, okay, but why did God make humans so similar to chimpanzees? Because the evolutionist argues, well, the chimpanzee is our closest cousin. Humans and chimps go back to a common ancestor, roughly 6 to 9 million years ago. And then those differences are a reflection of time. We might say those differences are a reflection of common design and separate ancestry, but they say it's a marker of time since the split. And so they'd ask, well, if common design's true, why is God creating humans so much more similar to the great apes than to other creatures in the biological world? Shouldn't it be more random and not look like common descent, Jerry?
Well, there are 2 million different species, they estimate, and huge number. And so we look for animals we can relate to. And I think if we don't have many chipmunks, many chimps in this country, which are pets, but some countries, they have a lot of them. They raise them from when they're born. They open their eyes, and they're just like a member of the family. and they fit right in. They wear diapers and they walk around, and it's just like a child. And many people find those pets very, very adorable, and I can see where they would. They can be very like a child in many ways. In fact, I'm told some people who can't have children, one option is they can adopt a baby chimp and they can raise it like a child, and they in many ways have a child. So I can see advantages of having. But then again, the vast 90% of all species are insects, or at least invertebrates, and so God must have really loved invertebrates to create so many different kinds of them. So there's a lot of reasons for the variety we see around us. But on the other hand, room is part of it too. If we had all the flies in the world were as large as a dog, we've had a problem space-wise.
Well, Andrew Cumming asked this from earlier. Why does the junk DNA or evolutionary mindset hinder science? I'll give one example, and then Jerry, since you've got so much experience in this field, perhaps you can give some. Firstly, when we go into the genome and looking for function and understanding just the overall functionality of not only us, but the biological world, when we have that creation starting point, we're expecting treasure function. And so we go in and that's what we can find. They, in many ways, accidentally found a lot of these functions for pseudogenes, non-coding sections of the genome, these gene deserts, ERVs. But one interesting one, Jerry, and you've presented on the P53 protein, the guardian of the genome. ERVs, one of their many functions, is in tumor suppression. They can perform viral mimicry, where transcribed ERVs give the appearance of the cell being invaded by a harmful retrovirus, right? So this process mediated by the P53 protein can actually, with the immune system, target that cell with the transcribed ERV with more destruction. That's incredible. And as a matter of fact, to perform that role of viral mimicry, the endogenous retrovirus has to share sequence similarity to exogenous retroviruses. So they got to have the GAG, the POL, the ENV, the LTRs on either side to perform or carry out that role. Now, here's kind of the punchline. Cancer researchers are looking at this function to help develop better cancer therapy drugs. Okay, so if we would have went into the genome with that thinking right away that these ERVs could be functional and not junk, evolutionary leftovers, well, we could be advancing in medicine and in health sooner rather than later, because evolutionists, again, and now I'm just going in circles, but they've assumed junk DNA. So they're kind of looking for junk, and then they accidentally find these functions and think, oh, okay, now we can start studying a little bit more in depth these functional roles, where we predicted it from the beginning, Jerry.
Well, yeah, I'm just saying from my experience in spending quite a few years in medical school, both as a student and as a researcher, it was just never mentioned. And what was mentioned is, how do we cure cancer? What's going on here? What's going on, and how can we affect the production of cancer cells? It's a matter of solving a problem. The problem for us was just, how do you cure cancer? How do you prevent it? How do you diagnose it? How do you impede it? Cancer cells, cancer, how do you deal with it? And so that was the focus. So we talked a lot about that, a lot about ways of dealing with that problem. And on the other hand, I don't remember anyone saying, well, gee, God created this cell to have this function. It was probably implied when they learned the function, especially P53, and it's implied, but just the co-creation evolution issue is not a concern. And surveys done by a number of people find that the whole creation, at least the evolution position, is not a concern in the vast majority of research. The vast majority of research, we're looking at solving questions. How do you lower the resistance in a wire? How do you get less resistance, produce less heat, etc., and increase the transmission of volts through the wire? That's the question. And the question of evolution never comes up. Surveys have asked specifically, in your research, does the question of evolution concern you? Does it come up? Is it of interest? And the vast majority of researchers say, no, it's not. What is the major interest? Solving a problem, understanding how something works. And so evolution, by and large, and so many important discoveries were made by creationists. So it certainly, from that standpoint, doesn't. And so many important discoveries were made by evolutionists too, but the evolution and creation world, by and large, has no effect. What has an effect is the curiosity, their ability to be able to find out what's going on here, asking questions, asking the right questions, or noticing things others didn't notice.
Wasn't the MRI machine invented by a creationist?
Yeah, Raymond Tamadian, who, even in this case, I don't think creation, as far as I know, didn't come up. What came up was, well, his grandmother died of cancer. It was a horrible disease. He saw that when he was growing up, and he thought about that. And when he was doing research in another area, he thought about maybe we put a mouse in a MRI machine, basically, and of course, it was not to measure people, but he put a mouse in there to find, I don't find what he was trying to find, but he was trying to find some elements or some problem. And he realized if you put mice in there and find out this information, probably make a really big MRI, and when you put people in there and you find out the similar information. So that was, in this case, that was his reasoning. He went from doing experiments, finding chemical analysis using some type of resonance research, and then came up with magnetic resonance imaging.
Wow. It's incredible. What a sophisticated machine and invention from a young earth creationist. And so why does it hinder science? As Andrew said, you mentioned, we talked about junk DNA, ERVs, cancer therapy and research there, vestigial structures. Correct me if I'm wrong, Jerry, but because of that evolutionary mindset, weren't people throughout time, oh, well, these are just vestigial, non-functional, not as important. So they're prematurely removing things like their tonsils, perhaps, or their appendix, other parts of the body that are actually contributing to the immune system. And yet they're removing these things prematurely. But if you have the creation mindset that, well, no, maybe we don't know the function yet, just like if I put my 4-year-old under the hood of a car and say, okay, start removing things you don't think are beneficial. He doesn't know. He's probably going to start removing everything because he doesn't know. He hasn't studied. He hasn't learned it enough yet. So for that reason, that would another example of how the evolutionary mindset hinders science, Jerry.
Yeah, that would be the best example and a good example, but there are other examples and part of it is it's just a concern with solving a problem. And therefore, but yeah, in this case, vestigial organs really got in the way. No question about that. In fact, many scientists will admit that this got in the way and that they discovered this organ was not vestigial accidentally. They just noticed something and this is supposed to have no function. This does not have any function. That's what I learned in school. And this experiment we did, this finding indicated it does have a function. So they must be wrong. But yeah, in this case, it really did impede scientific research. And there are others too, but maybe if I think about it, I bet if you did some research and wrote a paper on it, you could probably find a lot of areas where evolution has hindered research. It just isn't necessary. It just doesn't help. You just want to look at the problem and focus on the problem and don't need to bring in, I guess, evolution or creation, but probably as a whole, creation would be more important in helping because, for example, the backward retina. Why is this retina backward? God created us. Maybe there's a reason why he created the retina the way it is. And we looked and we found there's a very good reason for why the retina is created the way it was, why it works. So therefore, I would think in this case, and there are probably many other cases, if I thought about it, that creation did encourage looking at something in a certain way, which facilitated discovering how it works and why it works. So yeah, that'd be a good, maybe I should work on a paper in that area. But I could find a lot of examples.
Well, this critic says our fight or flight doesn't make sense without evolution.
I don't know why it would not. If fight or flight is a natural response, a response that's necessary for survival. I mean, yeah, when you're looking at evolution and survival, but obviously whether you're an evolutionist or creationist, survival is still a concern. And still, if an environment is threatening, you're going to want to leave. Whether you're a creationist or an evolutionist, it doesn't matter. You respond to the situation. So, and of course, natural selection, I mean, that's pretty obvious. we never had a problem with natural selection. That's straightforward. So when you
Right.
bring it into evolution, then you're bringing in to explain something beyond what it's designed to explain.
Selection is just a fine tuning mechanism that keeps a species as strong as it can be. It doesn't have any creative power to it. Andrew Cumming asks, and why do fish have the same structure in their eye?
Well, they have it probably for a lot of reasons. One, they're vertebrates, and the eye of a animal that lives in a certain environment can be designed a certain way. There are, what, 32 different eye designs, though? And so there is a variety of designs. And I would guess if we look at all those designs, probably the one they have is the best, which happens to be the same one that we have.
Well, and then they got to invoke convergent evolution, that these sophisticated structures like eyes or the echolocation system of certain creatures evolved independently, because they would say, well, this can't be the result of recent ancestry, like ichthyosaurs, dolphins, and sharks. They got a lot of similarities, streamlined bodies, designed and built for the ocean, but they believe they're separated too far on the tree of life. So they had to evolve all these features independently. You're telling me the eye evolved a couple dozen times independently, Jerry?
30 or 40 times they think it evolved independently,
Unreal.
and we end up with the same design, independent evolution. But that again is a way of trying to explain something from an evolutionary standpoint. But we don't need to explain it from an evolutionary standpoint. Probably fish has an eye very similar to ours because it lives in an environment which is very similar to ours.
Well, Andrew follows up and says humans and fish live in the same environment. That's news to me. Why don't octopuses and fish have the same eyes despite living both in the water then?
Okay, because octopuses live in a very dark part of the water. So octopuses have to be able to effectively take in more light. Of course, I guess you could argue, why don't octopuses have the same design that cats have? And cats can see much better than we can in the dark. So why don't octopuses have the same design? But these are good questions. But if I was asking these questions, I would just try to find out why and not propose evolution as the answer. I would. Although that's a good question, though. Why do fish have the same eyes? I don't know. That's a good question. That's why I like talking with evolutionists, because they raise some of these things that I'm curious. Why they have the same eyes? And we know most vertebrates do have the same eyes. Land vertebrates, at least. Of course, octopus is an invertebrate. So that's a good question. I would be interested. Andrew, maybe you can let me know why the eyes are and are they really the same?
I think
would guess they're not exactly the same. I would guess they're probably more sensitive to certain conditions, like water distorts the image that we get. So it may be designed differently to be able to survive in a watery world. But yeah, Andrew, hey, we would like to know why fish have the same eye or a similar eye. My guess is a similar eye.
yes, because evolutionists are going to say, well, octopus and fish have different eyes because they evolved through completely separate evolutionary paths. But I think this goes back to what you're saying. God likes variety. And again, going to the world of design, man-made things, modes of transportation, critics love that one. But you can find the same vehicle like a Volkswagen Jetta, but you can get it in either a diesel or a regular engine. Well, why not the same? How come it's not just all regular engine? Or why not just all, diesel?
Yeah.
Or why not a vehicle just rear wheel drive and not four-wheel drive or all-wheel? Well, there's variety, I think. So same thing in the ocean environment or the water environment. You can find varieties of the eye structure, for example, maybe used for the same function. Just like a vehicle, that engine, regardless of what type of engine, it's used to get you from A to B to move you forward. But that design, that variety is always nice, isn't it, Jerry?
Yeah, I used to know why octopuses had the uh, we have an inverted eye. The retina is backwards, and the octopus, of course, doesn't have that design. And you study so many things, and I remember learning why the octopus had that particular design, the opposite of what we have. And I think the reason is the sensitivity, vision in water in its particular watery world is different, but I can't remember now. But then I couldn't remember Michael Shermer's name, and I've known him for 20 years, and I have 4 books written by him. Now, why in the world couldn't I remember Michael Shermer's name? That doesn't make sense. And I have at least 5 books written by him, and I've written articles about him. So how in the world could I not remember his name? That's a problem.
Well, you've got a lot of information over the years of all the study that you've done, Dr. Bergman. So it's not always easy to remember everything right on the spot. Here's a question that comes in from Concept Creator. Question: what's the story behind Neanderthals? Were they real? And what does that have to do with the biblical account of Adam and Eve?
Neanderthals were real people. They walked around and they had bigger brains than we have, and they were good at certain sports, very good at certain sports. They would probably today, if they were still around as a more, quote, pure race of Neanderthals, pure people group, they probably would be engaged in certain activities which their skills would fit for them. I know I have, me and many others, my relatives came from several countries. One was from the area where Neanderthals live. And I know I have, I think 4 or 5 or 6% of my DNA is from Neanderthals. And so I know that for decades, they were seen as a less evolved human, pictured as brutes that lived in caves. And now, according to the National Geographic, which we know is always correct, the National Geographic say Neanderthals, they are just one of us. They are just people like you and I, and many probably look very similar to you and I. And if you put flesh on them, you take the skull and the bones and put flesh on them and let them walk down Main Street, you wouldn't recognize them as being different at all.
Right.
And so it's a matter of they're just another people group. And it's nice they're different people groups, because when I would visit countries like Japan, people look like they're Japanese. When I visit other countries, people would look, well, they'd be different. Now you walk around in America and you see so many people who look like they're Japanese. Why bother going to Japan? Just go down to certain areas of the United States where there are lots of Japanese people. You can visit Japan without traveling to Japan. So we enjoy differences in people, and that's nice. We have differences. Just imagine if everybody in the world, I shouldn't
Looked
say
exactly the same.
everybody in the world looked exactly like me. It would be horrible.
That'd be a good looking world, brother.
Oh, don't I wish?
And a very intelligent world too. Well, why is it that, there's so much variety in humans, but then if you go pick a certain animal, go to the zoo, African lion safari, my kids went there this summer, anywhere where you're going to see a bunch of animals, a lot of variety of humans, but then pick your animal, lion, tiger, monkey. It's just kind of, there's just a lot of individuals, but they all look basically the same, Jerry.
The facial recognition software, they claim they can differentiate everybody in the earth. And so once they know your face, you can have 2,000 people walk in front of the camera and they can determine who you are. Even identical twins, they are able to differentiate. So scary technology, I suppose, but in the future, we may not have to show a license to get into a plane or a passport. They'll just get a picture of our face. They'll know who we are. They'll know where we're from. They'll know our background. And we can either get on the plane or not. And so that's what they claim. And
they can't do that with animals, though, can they?
Well, yeah, animals is more difficult, I understand. That we have, and that's good. We have a sense of variety. When I'm in the food store and my wife is shopping separately, I can often tell her looking at the back. I don't need to look at her front. I can look at the back and I can say, there's my wife over there in the hot dog aisle. So there she is, and I can walk up there, and 99% of the time, not 100, but 99% of the time, there she is. So I can recognize her. And so that's good. We can recognize others very quickly. And that's amazing. We have 2 eyes, we have a nose, we have a mouth, very similar face, but yet we have arrangements in such a way to where we look very, very different, even though we only have 3 basic points. Well, 2 more if you want to add ears. 2 more basic points, which differentiates us from everybody in the whole world.
Well, the Bible in Genesis, God did say, be fruitful and multiply. He didn't say be fruitful and clone yourselves. And so that starting point makes sense, that God would have front-loaded Adam and Eve with pre-existing DNA internal diversity that could generate a lot of variety. quickly because those DNA differences would be front loaded, Jerry, there from the beginning. Where evolutionists, they have to explain over millions of years how the accumulation neutral mutations followed by natural, so that they basically act as a hidden reservoir of genetic diversity. But we know the majority of those are deleterious, unfortunately. On your Neanderthal point, I was listening to a lecture, as I like to do, from their own side. And it was an evolutionary paleoanthropologist who, at the end of his lecture, Jerry, he literally said on Neanderthals, he said, Neanderthals are us, but simply adapted to the cold ecoglacial environment. Well, isn't that kind of what we're saying in our model, that the
that's
post-flood ice age?
It's like the Eskimos, most or the Inuit, whatever word you want to use, but the people that live far north in Canada, they all look very similar, at least compared to us. And therefore, people from Europe tend to look quite similar, at least comparatively. People from other parts of the world tend to have similarities. And what explains that? I think what explains that is epigenetics. Epigenetics allows us to adapt to our environment in time, and therefore we have similarities, which we didn't have when the first few people went to the North Pole, or at least that area, the northern Canada. And so therefore we have enormous ability to adapt. It's also, studies have found that the blacks from Africa who came over here as slaves, dark, very, very dark skin, etc., they are slowly becoming lighter, and they are slowly becoming more Western, more European. And now intermarriage is part of the reason, but part of the reason also is they say that the environment is actually affecting, because of epigenetics, the black population. And so therefore we end up, and I've noticed that, you look, so many blacks now, they look more brown, they look less like the dark African black and more, in fact, some look very, very European, or at least have very European traits. So that would be a good example of how we do adapt.
Well, and we know that environment does dictate morphology. And so if you have people moving out, and I think this is where we can answer this question, because I do think that you did answer it, because this critic is saying that didn't really answer the question. Where did they go? Well, if you think about it, after the flood, either shortly before the Babel dispersal or after the Babel dispersal, you have a small tribe or small family that branches off, and they go and live in a less than ideal environment in Eurasia, the cold ecoglacial environment. Well, if it's epigenetics, like you're saying, that could result in a rapid adaptation to those environments. But it's interesting because there's several papers, Jerry, that document how Neanderthals were 40% less fit than modern humans because they accumulated a high genetic load. They have these massive stretches of identical letters in their DNA, so massive stretches of homozygosity, telling us that they're inbred. That makes sense because they're in small tribes, they're inbreeding. A lot of recessive deleterious mutations are coming to the forefront. And so that small group probably, in my opinion, we can get your thoughts, Jerry, to the questioner, they probably died off or assimilated with modern humans. We do have their DNA. We have their genetics, of course. And so I think the evolutionary or the creation model has a nice explanation for how Neanderthals came about and where they went. But Jerry, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, a lot of intermarriage, of course. That's why so many, when I mention that to friends that I'm, 3% Neanderthal, they say, well, I am too. I mean, my guess is it'd be a lot of people. It said the average person who lives in Gaza has at least 1 or 2 or 3% Jewish blood in them. And so when these people talk about the Gazan people, and that's logical because Jews live in Semitic areas, and many people in that area are Semitic, period, whether they live in Gaza or the local areas. And so you'd expect to find a large number of intermarriage, at least going way back. And so therefore you'd expect a large number of people in the West also have Neanderthal DNA, as I do and as many other people do. And so therefore, and some were killed in wars. Some were fighting over territory. And I would imagine the Europeans, the Germans, probably going way, way back, the Germanic people probably fought over land with the Neanderthals, and probably they prevailed. They had more technology than Neanderthals. They may have prevailed and therefore killed lots of the Neanderthals. We are really only coming up to this question now because for centuries it was believed Neanderthals became extinct a long, long, long time ago. And now we know that that's not true, that Neanderthals did intermarriage for decades, and they were probably lived until, I don't know, 300, 400, 500 years after Jesus. And so they probably, besides intermarriage, my guess is a lot of them were probably killed in battles.
Right.
The Slavic people in Russia probably killed a large number.
And even the evolutionary model, I'm going to Google it right now. How many Neanderthals were there? It's not like they existed in these massive populations. It says at any given time, scientists estimate that there are only about 3,000 to 10,000 breeding Neanderthals living across Europe and Asia. And so that makes sense according to the creation model. Perhaps some groups migrating away before Babel, even right after Babel. And then I guess with the modern Homo sapien phenotype, I guess you could say, Jerry, do you think then they came about, and like you said, war, conquest, competition, battle, and so eventually those smaller groups were wiped away for those reasons, but also interbreeding took place, so assimilated in a sense to where we can have their genes today.
Yeah, probably Neanderthals interbred a lot if they had small populations, as you mentioned. Therefore, probably a lot of the traits they had are a result of interbreeding, not because of a particular trait that was rare among people at that time. But those people that interbred, these traits dominated because of interbreeding so much. My guess is they probably married cousins and relatives and so on, and so they ended up with a lot of traits that we associate with Neanderthals, which happened to be the case because of small populations interbreeding.
Well, even according to their model, they say here they lived in small, spread out bands and rarely mixed with other groups. Okay. So within those little bands, inbreeding, so interbreeding, and then selection would basically break down, fixation would dominate. And that would, because the next question would be, Jerry, is a lot of critics, more informed critics like Dr. Dan Stern Cardinal in the chat, Creation Myths, they would say, well, Neanderthals couldn't have descended from Adam and Eve. They must be a sister species because their genetics are too different. But with what we're talking about here, if they have the smaller tribes, smaller bands, interbreeding within those tribes, localized groups, then you'd have them changing because you'd have faster rates of fixate. A lot of deleterious mutations are coming to the forefront, getting stuck in place locally amongst all the different tribes. And so they're changing rapidly as compared to other humans, like the modern Homo sapien phenotype, as the questioner says, Homo sapien versus Neanderthals. And so therefore, Jerry, doesn't it make sense that Neanderthal genetics would be different than our genetics today for these reasons and more?
Oh, yeah, it probably would be, especially the small population. I know interbreeding among any small population tends to produce problems. And we've had a fortunate in America and in Europe that there's so much intermixing among American people. I mean, I've got relatives from Britain. I got relatives from Finland. I have relatives from Germany. I have relatives from Russia. And I bet you probably have relatives from many different groups. So in your family background, my guess is a lot of mixture. And therefore, there wasn't much relatively small interbreeding between you and your wife, because probably your wife, now my wife is German and I'm German background too, but she says German background from Austria and from other areas, where I have German background from the northern areas, from Finland and other areas in northern Germany. And so therefore we're different because of our backgrounds. And that's probably true with a large number of couples. They have different backgrounds, and therefore the interbreeding among them is pretty low. And we have so many Americans that married American Indians. A large number of Americans married American Indians, and therefore we have even more variety because of this large amount of intermarriage. I don't remember the data, but quite a large number of Americans married American Indians. And this is a problem because when all the Indians were kicked out of the States and moved to Oklahoma, what do you do with all these wives that were husbands were European? And so they had to deal with that when they were unfortunately kicking out all the Indians off their land and sending them to Oklahoma or other Western states. And so, but there were a large number, even congressmen and high level ranked Americans, they had American Indian wives, and or some American Indian men had English wives. And so that's you get the interbreeding is especially among the Amish, and therefore you have a lot of problems among the Amish that you don't normally have. And to reduce this, they've arranged with these meetings where you Amish from Ohio go to Pennsylvania specifically to meet mates, specifically not to interbreed with the local Amish where they're from. And so even the Amish recognize the problems of interbreeding, and therefore they try to avoid that by marrying outside of the clan. And that's why they go to Pennsylvania to look for spouses.
Well, yeah, it's a good point. And that would largely explain, if this was the case for the Neanderthals, why genetically they were 40% less fit. And I'm curious if you've seen this paper right here, Jerry. So on the screen, this is a couple excerpts and it talks about how defects in DNA repair enzymes, they can increase the germline mutation rate. But this paper is not talking 2 or even 3 times more. Notice this, it says our findings imply, and I use these slides in a recent debate I did with a molecular biologist, because undoubtedly they're going to ask, well, why did Neanderthals have more mutations, or why do some African lineages have more mutations than non-African? But notice the hypervariable mutation rate. So they say our findings imply that defects in DNA repair genes can increase germline mutation rates. But this excerpt here, by how much? Well, they say here we analyzed the genome-wide sequences of over 21,000 families with rare genetic diseases and identified 12 individuals with a hypermutated genome with between 2 and 7 times, so up to 7 times more de novo single nucleotide variants. And so, in other words, if damaged DNA repair enzymes can then result in more mutations accumulating per generation, well, what happens if an early Neanderthal family or tribe, possibly living in caves, being exposed to chemicals or radiation rocks? Jerry, the flood would have produced a lot of radiation and heat, so perhaps they're exposed to uranium. And so they get some errors in DNA repair enzymes. And now for a few generations, they're passing on a bunch more mutations to the next generation. Wouldn't that also account for why Neanderthals could be so different genetically to us today?
Yeah, it could well be. Yeah, could a lot of reasons. And that's another possibility. I don't think that's a major area of research science is looking at today. But on the other hand, it's interesting questions that we like to ask. One of the main focuses of most
could be a good research project.
Yeah, it would be if you were trying to do some research to get your PhD, then that would be a good topic you could look at.
Well, our good friend Dan's wondering. He says, I'm behind, but I just got to the junk DNA part. Well, Dan, one of these days, hopefully we'll get you to admit that junk DNA is junk science. Dan still holds to the idea that only about 10% of the genome's functional. So he says, and I've yet to hear a creationist explain. I got some immediate thoughts on this, but Jared, we'll get your thoughts. Explain what the DNA does that's outside of the 8 to 9% that you can't delete. So I'm interpreting this without more context. He's saying only 8 to 9% of the genome is conserved, maybe, and essential, where if you remove it, then you're going to die. Basically, the organism will die. They won't be able to pass on their genes. Whereas all the rest of the other genome, the 90% maybe, he's saying you could remove it or delete it and you'll be fine. And then maybe they extrapolate that to mean it's junk. Jerry, what are your thoughts?
I've done several recent articles, and boy, I've pretty clear in the articles that I'm looking at from major scientific journals like Science and Nature. They pretty clearly state that more and more, and they're expecting that the large majority of the so-called junk DNA has a function. And I just did an article a month or 2 months ago, If you look on my website, crev.info, and look for junk DNA, you should find it. I think it's on there, but when you do 3 articles a week, I can discover articles online and say, well, this is a really good article. Hey, I wrote it. That's interesting. I wrote this article.
And you forgot you wrote it.
So when you write that many, you can't keep track of. My friends who published 3 articles in their life remember specifically about the 3 articles, but I don't have that luxury. I have over 2,300 some articles. So
wow.
But I do remember several articles that I had written that did cover that were close to finding out what the vast majority of DNA does. I don't remember the number, but I do talk about it in that article, and it should be online or will be online soon. So if your friend looks at that, he may. But if you just type in junk DNA, uses found for junk DNA, I bet you'll get lots of references. What do you get? Uses for junk DNA, or functions for junk DNA, functions for what was so-called junk DNA.
Let's see what Google comes up with. Well, they say it's probably going to have an evolutionary slant. Scientists view non-coding DNA as a vast category containing an estimated 8 to 15% of functional sequences. So, I mean, clearly a lot of the evolutionists are still viewing it as junk, but I think they have to, Jerry, because once they admit that the vast majority of DNA is functional, now they have to admit that firstly, we don't find this evidence of common descent in our genomes, because if common descent is true, we've been evolving for millions of years. Yeah, it makes sense that you'd accumulate a lot of genetic baggage or viral fossils, ERVs and retrotransposons and pseudogenes. But a bigger point, well, an equally important point, is then these neutral mutations, if they're accumulating in functional regions of the genome, now they're nearly neutral, slightly deleterious. So I think they got to maintain a genome, don't they, Jerry, of about 90% junk in order to decrease the mutation rate, harming functional regions.
Oh, they do. But if you want to get an article published in Science or Nature, just find some uses for a small percent of DNA here and find out it has a use. I bet you have a pretty good chance of getting that article affected if you've done your work and shown indeed it does have a use. And the articles I've referenced, several recently basically found uses. And I would think it would be a challenge. But you're right. They need the junk DNA to explain evolution. But some people are not worried about that. They're just worried about getting your master's thesis done and getting a job and getting married.
Right.
So.
Well, just because a region of the genome is not conserved and again, those differences I think would reflect separate ancestors. We're not going to expect the let's say function in embryological development or information flow in humans and chimps or humans and dogs to be exactly the same. So where they interpret, well, this is not conserved, it's accumulating a lot of mutations, they're the ones assuming those differences are mutations. I'd argue otherwise. But just because you can remove parts of the genome, would that mean those parts are non-functional? Isn't there a lot of functional redundancy? Well, I have a spare tire in the back of my car. Is that non-functional? No, I mean, if I get a flat tire, Jerry, that's going to come in handy, isn't it?
Yeah, what they're realizing, most of the so-called junk DNA does is a regulatory function, that it's non-coding. You have a lot of coding DNA and you have a lot of non-coding DNA. And the non-coding DNA they're finding more and more as functions. A primary one, or at least a major one, is regulation, genetic regulation. Right. And so therefore, I guess that surprised me to hear that, and surprised because stuff I'm reading pretty consistently is finding lots of important uses for the so-called junk DNA. That may be a historical function like useless vestigial organs. In 20 years, we may say the so-called junk DNA. My guess is we'll find the vast majority of it has uses, or at least it's in that direction. And again, I keep finding articles that supports that. And I just surprised to read about the ones who claim that it's still 8 or 9% that you can't delete.
Well, I've got papers right in my slideshow where it talks about ERVs, once assumed to be junk DNA, now known to function in the immune system. So these papers are from the conventional literature, are constantly pointing out the fact that they've assumed a lot of junk DNA, and now that's not so much the case. And then they list here too, gene regulation, structural support, RNA production, like you said, 3D nuclear architecture. That's interesting. What they call evolutionary raw material, but we could just say good, healthy variation that God put there for adaptive purposes. So that a lot of that could be there too. Just waiting for the right environment to turn it on. So sure, you could probably snip something like that out if it's not turned on, and you'd be fine. So it doesn't demonstrate non-function. But it is pretty wild in 2026, Jerry, that a lot of evolutionists would still hold to junk DNA.
This is a good example where DNA is being, and its use is being blocked by the evolution glasses. Evolution glasses says, well, it must be junk, so therefore, why should we try to find a use for it? And I think that scientists should take the position that it all has a use. Now let's just try to find out what it is.
Exactly. And that's the creationist mindset. That's why the creationist mindset doesn't hinder science. Jerry, Dan here, again, who you debated, he likes to say, well, because we've discovered from ENCODE and subsequent projects, they pointed out that over 80% of the genome is active, biochemically active, a lot of transcription going on. But Dan would argue that, yeah, okay, but this is just noise. This is just spurious transcription. It's not useful or beneficial transcription. If you were to debate, how would you respond to that?
It just surprises me because from my perception is that so much of it has important uses. And I guess my orientation is such where it all has a use. And it's possible that some doesn't have a use, but I would say it's relatively small. And so, by the way, I enjoyed debating Dan. He was a good guy. He had brought some good points out. So he's like the evolutionist I've worked with. They're good guys, even though we have different worldviews. And
we'll keep them around.
Yeah, we'll keep them around. Yeah, we'll let them continue challenge our thinking, which is good. Sending comments and helping us reason about these things that we haven't thought about. Because I just never thought.
Our critics are gifts
to
creation science. They give us research opportunities. I would say to Dan, okay, we know only limited numbers of transcription factors are produced, these transcription factor proteins. So if they were binding randomly across the genome, they would be unavailable for the specific regulatory sites that they must control. And so it sounds like, and not to mention the fact that transcription is an energy intensive, resource intensive process. Every time you add a single nucleotide to a growing RNA chain, Jerry, aren't you consuming even just a little bit of energy, a little bit of ATP? So if what Dan is saying is true, why not over time? How come evolutionary mechanisms didn't weed out all this genetic baggage? Wouldn't that save resources for the cell?
Yeah, that's true. It does use up some energy, small, but it's there. And the longer the DNA, the more the chance of getting damaged. The advantage is shorter DNA, less chance of radiation or other damage. The longer the DNA, presumably, the greater the chance of being damaged.
Well, and Dan here, I think this is an easy refutation. He says, goodness me. He says, oh, goodness. Just got to the Neanderthal part. Figured you'd like that, Dan. He's very invested in Neanderthals, refuting creation. He says they're inbred. Yes. The end stage Neanderthal is inbred. That's true. So they aren't accumulating mutations faster. Well, I said, if you remember at the beginning, a small family or tribe, they can start off and they could experience damaged DNA repair enzymes, become hypermutating at first. And then eventually as they grow and then spread out, but start interbreeding within their small localized tribes, now they become more inbred. So hypermutating at first. So they're changing from the normal population. You got a lot of local fixation and change there. And then eventually you get all these bands of Neanderthals, a lot of inbreeding going on. So then you get change, even more change. So I don't see why that's a contradiction. Hypermutating at first and then inbred later stage Neanderthal.
Yeah, the concern of inbred is you end up with a accumulation of mutations in one person or a few people. And Darwin was worried about that. And that's why he had a couple of children that died. And he was worried about that because he married his cousin. And he
Right.
was worried about interbreeding. That's why the Amish are concerned about this for good reason. So guy wants to find a girl. So they say, okay, we're going to Pennsylvania. Pack your bags. We're taking a trip to Pennsylvania. And you meet some nice people there to marry. And that's what they do. They're deliberately trying to reduce the interbreeding and try to reduce the mutation because they have quite a high mutational load, and they've got all kinds of diseases which are well known, and geneticists love to study the Amish because they've got quite a category of diseases they can study because of interbreeding.
It leads to disease, and Dan would say, well, if you're inbreeding, then you're reducing genetic diversity rather than increasing genetic diversity. So how is that a faster mutation rate?
Well, because the chances are my cousin has a lot more mutations than this person in Africa who I've never met. And therefore, when I interbreed with this person, the female, our children will have my mutations and his mutations. And so the mutational load will be higher. And also may have my mutations, homozygous mutation, and he may have or she may have a homozygous mutation, and then we have heterozygous mutation, and then we got a problem. So many mutations are not a problem when you have one good gene and one bad gene. So the homozygous is the problem.
So with a population like that, take Neanderthals, small population interbreeding with each other, you're saying that there's a higher chance of those alleles, homozygous alleles, matching up to lead to disease.
Right, because you end up with the two damaged alleles and you end up with a problem. That's why for the black population, when you intermarry among other blacks, you get a gene, you marry somebody, your offspring gets the other gene, and then you have a homozygous gene for sickle cell anemia, for example, where when a black marries a white, that's rare for sickle cell anemia. It has the sickle cell anemia gene, but it's not a problem unless you have two sickle cell anemia genes. And that's
so sickle cell, you need both to actually have the disease.
Right.
They both have to line up. But if you're heterozygous, then you won't get the disease.
And that's true with many diseases.
Interesting.
You have to
so inbreeding will actually give you both copies then.
Right. And that's the concern. And that's the concern with inbreeding, period. Not only with sickle cell anemia, but there's a whole list of diseases that are at issue, like hemophilia, I believe, and this loss of digits, etc., is a problem. So we're almost off.
Yes. We could keep going and going. So Dan,
got lots of questions.
This has been quite the Ask a Scientist program. We're gonna have to do it again next month or whenever you're free, Jerry, because there's I just wanted to see. Oh, we got a lot more questions coming in, but perhaps we need to clarify. He says no, inbreeding typically makes you homozygous recessive. Yeah, it would make you more. The inbreeding reveals the hidden reservoir of genetic mistakes. So in recessive form, recessive dominant, the recessive ones are coming to the forefront, which can manifest in disease, right, Jerry?
Yeah, right.
So you have Neanderthals, you have all these recessive deleterious mutations coming to the forefront, leading to rapid genetic degeneration. Diverging more, because that's Dan's argument. Oh, well, they nest phylogenetically different from modern Homo sapiens. Well, for all of these reasons, plus more that we could get into, yeah, you'd expect them to be. And then there's been a few thousand years since the extinction of Neanderthals for us to accumulate even more genetic differences.
For many diseases, you have to have both genes have to be damaged. You have one gene that works, you may have the trait, but you won't have the disease. And so that's why intermarriage is so strongly condemned. Well, in many states, it's illegal. It's illegal because realizing that intermarriage produces more genetic problems because you get both genes in one person that are damaged. And therefore, the trait ends up appearing. And the Amish have shown that, and generally health-wise, you're better off marrying somebody who is not nearly related to you. Whites have healthier children when they marry blacks. Whites and blacks tend to have healthier children as a whole. they don't have diseases that are common among whites. They don't have diseases that are common among blacks. And so so I guess I can't understand his question, but anyways, I have a wife that wants me to walk the
Yes.
dog, so
and your dog deserves to be walked.
he
Brother,
deserves to be walked.
this has been a marathon program. And so this was a ton of fun. Jerry, God bless you and all the work you're doing. I think your presentation here tonight was very important. Everybody needs to watch it. We had some great Q&A here. We've still got a great audience with endless questions. So Jerry, any final words, final thoughts as we wrap up our program
Send me
tonight?
the link so I can pass it on to people who tuned at 6:30 and they didn't watch it, and they had several said I can't watch it because I'm going away at 7 or something. So I want to send them a link so that they can watch it. So send me the link to this particular program so I can send it off to people who want to watch it.
Perfect. I like it. Jerry, I appreciate your time. Thank you for your work that you've done to uphold the truth of biblical Christianity. Doki Doki here says, thank you, Jerry. See more from Dr. Bergman. We've got a whole playlist of your programs on the channel and also on the website. Okay, well, I hope you all enjoyed this as much as I did. We're at nearly 3 hours here. It doesn't feel like it because we could discuss these technical topics related to origins and ancestry all day. So much fun, so many challenges and criticisms always coming in from from our critics here. And that's good. They're a gift to creation science. They're a gift to us, Brother Jerry. Gives us a lot to discuss. So God bless you all. Stand for Truth is signing off.